Fate. Souls and Singularities Chapter 103-105. 103. Halloween. 7 Halloween. The Singing Pumpkin Castle. 7. Wine? Archon asked, holding a jug above Ritska's goblet. The master blinked at the man as he remained seated at the table before he slowly raised his hand and covered up the top of the cup. Still staring at the others with a bizarre expression. I'm underage? Why did you phrase it like a question? Because honestly, with the way this day has been going, I'm not even sure if that counts for anything. He replied with an honest shrug. Also, I'm worried that if I start drinking now, I'm going to pull a Lancer and just keep drinking until the madness fades away, and that definitely sounds like a bad idea. Archon pulled the jug back and stared at it for a few moments before looking back at the master. Juice? Please. The Silver Knight nodded once and then turned away, walking back towards one of the tables at the side of the room. Ritska returned his attention to the table where the others were all seated around with plates of food in front of them, all of them wearing puzzled looks. Eventually Ritska could no longer contain his bafflement. What are we even doing? You're enjoying a banquet before the show. The cat girl responded with a wide smile as she approached the table with a large pumpkin which had obviously been cooked. Ritska was personally curious as to why the pumpkin had been a jack-o'-lantern. Sigurd was staring at the pumpkin on the plate with wide eyes before he slowly looked towards his helmet he had placed on the floor. It is only natural that a maid and a butler would serve guests in a castle, right? Probably. Ritska replied before he could help it, then gradually looked back over to Archon as the man approached the table again with a different jug and poured out an orange liquid into the goblet until it was nearly at the top before he pulled the jug back. Thanks. So, Mash coughed into her hands as she gave the cat girl a polite smile. We are here to eat before we see Elizabeth singing, miss? Cat. The maid replied with a perfectly straight face. Cat? Ritska parroted to her with a raised eyebrow and an expression which was practically begging her to say she was only joking. The wide smile and frantic nod of the head she gave caused his expression to fall flat. Cat. The woman then paused as she noticed Kiyohime giving her an odd expression. Is something wrong? No, Kiyohime replied in a slow tone. It is simply that you bear a strong resemblance to someone I might know from somewhere. But you two are nothing alike. She then paused and furrowed her brows. Unless this is something that lies at her heart. I'm still baffled by this turn of events. Sigurd bluntly stated as he moved to his side and then pulled out a hip flask and unscrewed the lid, pouring the liquid into the goblet in front of them, then pausing and looking around when he saw the expressions of shock from everyone else on the table. Yes? You just carry that around with you? You never know when you might need to offer someone a toast. Sigurd spoke in a short tone, then nodded over to Ash. I offered some to him 3 times and we shared a toast. The attention moved from Sigurd to Ash. The saber nodded once. Siegbrow tastes good. Do you want some? Sigurd offered the flask towards Ash. The saber only gave a single nod as Sigurd filled up the goblet in front of him and then screwed the lid back on before he paused and looked around. Anyone else fancy some? No, I'm fine. No thank you. Nao. Is it strong? The last one coming from Archon. The knight staring at Sigurd with his full attention. I believe so. Sigurd nodded his head. Well, it is for undead like myself and Ash, but I'm sure that if it's strong enough for undead, then it is fine for me. Archon replied. If it is not trouble. He added on, giving a long sigh. Silver Knights are not forbidden for merriment and I did frequent a tavern on occasion. However, drinking on duty is usually looked down upon. He nodded his head in the direction of Cat. I feel as though this is an exception. If you say so. Sigurd shrugged, then topped up one of the spare goblets for Archon before screwing the flask shut and returning it to wherever it had come from. Ritska leaned to the side and stared with furrowed brows, watching as the hip flask quite literally disappeared into motes of light, raising his eyebrows as he looked between Sigurd and the missing flash with bafflement. Now then, a toast, Sigurd exclaimed with a large smile as he grabbed his goblet and held it aloft. To our journey, this festival, and the many adventures that await. Long may the sun shine. He brought the goblet to his lips and took a swing of the liquid before chuckling to himself. Ask took a long sip of the liquid before placing the goblet back on the table, his expression hardly changing as he drank. Ritska made to drink his juice before he paused, goblet barely touching his lips and eyes focused on Archon. He was not alone in the attention he was giving the Silver Knight as the eyes of everyone else soon drifted to him. The knight had his head tipped back, helmet still on his head, and goblet pressed into the groove at the front of the helm and pouring the liquid directly into his mouth without showing any sign of stopping. After what felt like eons, Archon eventually lowered the empty goblet and placed it back on the table, swaying slightly on his feet before he shook his head slightly. That was strong, yes. He spoke in a slightly slurred tone, nodding once to Sigurd, my thanks. You're welcome, stop trying to get drunk. Kat ordered him with a stern frown as she pointed at the man. You're a butler. How can you be expected to collect their orders and coats if you can't stand up straight? Woof. Woof. Mash blinked profusely at Kat in bafflement. Woof. Why, I thought you said you were a. Don't, Archon warned her off, shaking his head from side to side. Just, don't, she won't answer. I did answer you. Kat pointed a clawed finger at the man. I said that I am a fox so it's all right. But you said your name was Kat? Ash asked with furrowed brows. It is, but, you claim to be some manner of fox. I am. Kat placed her hands on her hips and gave a wide smile. I am Tama Kat, one of the 9 aspects of Tamamo no Mae. Ritska, who had been drinking at the time, spat out the juice in his mouth, breaking down into a choking fit as he stared at Kat with wide eyes, staggering to his feet and pointing at the woman with the red face. T. Tamamo no Mae. Romani blurted out through the communicator. The man's face appeared and looked similarly shocked. The fox spirit. No, I'm Tama Kat. Kat replied with a frown, crossing her arms and frowning, completely different. Woof. For example, I'm clearly superior. Ash blinked and looked around. Is she important? Tamamo no Mae is considered to be a fox spirit behind the downfall of several dynasties. Ash helpfully explained while giving Kat a newly suspicious expression. Although that was under the persona of Daji, who was also identified to be a 9-tailed fox. The pattern repeats itself as she was said to possess other women and bring about calamities which led to the ends of the kingdoms. Alright, no need to bring up an embarrassing past, you know? Kat pointed at Mash. Besides, I'm Tama Kat. I'm only one part of the Tamamo 9. Tamamo 9? Sigurd raised an eyebrow, then pointedly looked at the single tail on her back. Is it because you have 9 tails? Yep. 9 tails, 9 personalities. Kat explained with a smirk. I'm clearly the best, woof. Probably her instinctive and bestial aside. Kiyohime bluntly surmised with a curious frown before turning to the knight. And you? Archon, Silver Knight of an Orlando. The man replied in a dulled tone, then raised a white-gloved hand and pointed at Kat, and somehow her subordinate. How did this happen? I was there when he was summoned. Woof, Kat explained as she placed her hands on her hips and puffed out her chest. It means I can also get someone to sort out all the tables while I do all the cooking. How are you responsible for summoning a Silver Knight? Glad you asked. Kat pointed at Ash as he asked the question, then at Archon. It's actually because. Don't answer that. Archon cut her off, his head in his hands as he moved over to one of the side tables and slumped down into one of the chairs. I feel a sense of dread, that to have that question answered would uncover some terrible secret. Well, fine then. Kat pouted, crossing her arms and looking away. I won't answer it then if you care so much. Thank you. Thank you what? Thank you, Divine Avatar Kat. Perfect. Remember when I said earlier we had hit peak madness? Ritska spoke as he sat back down, whispering to Mash, who was sitting next to him. The girl nodded her head in response. I need to change my definition of peak madness because otherwise we're just going to keep topping it. Should I make a note of it, Senpei? She whispered back with a serious expression. Ritska paused for a moment before nodding his head. You should not worry too much about these types of people, Enshin-sama. Kiyohime assured the master from her spot on the other side of him, frowning slightly in the direction of Kat. However, they really do sometimes just appear from nowhere. I specialize in surprises. Kat called out from the opposite end of the room with a carefree expression before her eyes turned predatory. Besides Snake Girl, I can appear whenever I want. Do you actually handle food with those paws of yours? Kiyohime found herself asking with an appalled expression, do you not have the most basic sense of hygiene in that hide of yours? She waved her hand in the direction of the food. What do you do when you get orange hair in the food? Where are your gloves and hairnets? Ha, as if I'd need something like that. Kat scoffed, waving her hand in a dismissive manner, my cooking and cleaning skills are in the X rank. I'm Tamamo Kat Mado. Mado, Ritsuka whispered to himself with a puzzled expression as he took another sip of his drink, looking over to the opposite side of the table to see that both Ash and Sigward had since given up trying to understand the woman and Archon was still sitting in the chair at the far end of the room with his head in his hands. I'm a student of Beni Enma herself. Who? Ritsuka furrowed his brows and looked around, seeing that no one else understood who she was actually talking about either. Woof. Are we all Ain Rorant? Oh good lord. Ritsuka pinched the bridge of his nose at the pun, finding the strength leaving his body. You look tired, Fujimaru-kun. Romani spoke with a strained tone of voice through the communicator. It's tough keeping up with these people, was the reply the doctor received from the young man as he took another sip of his juice. He heard the director give a hum in the background. Romani turned towards her and raised an eyebrow before he noted that her expression seemed to be mildly vindictive. As if she was enjoying the fact that someone else was having to put up with the insanity instead of her. The expression lasted until she noticed Romani was looking at her, upon which she scowled at the man and caused him to spin his chair back around. So you're saying that my cooking is so amazing that it can seemingly defy common sense? Kat remarked as she leaned over Kiyohime with a wide smile, thank you for the compliment. I wasn't complimenting you. Kiyohime swiftly retorted as she closed up her fan and pressed the end of it onto her forehead before pushing her back, and keep away from me. Kat blinked, leaning back and frowning down at her, placing her hands on her hips and giving a thoughtful frown, so you're not complimenting me and you're saying that you want me to go. She shook her head, so one of us has to die then. Ritsuka stopped drinking. That's a jump in logic isn't it? Yeah, Kat pointed at Ritsuka. You get it might not master because you've never seen me before today, acquaintance. We need a real heart-to-heart. Her paws stretched out and claws the length of Ritsuka's forearm jutted off from them, the boy promptly paling at the sight of the curved back scythes. I am so glad you understand. I think you're misinterpreting my suggestion. I am a guard after all. Kat exclaimed as she rolled away from the group and then hunched down on all fours like a cat, tensing her body as if preparing to pounce forwards. It's my job to set the traps and cook the jack-o'-lanterns. You aren't meant to eat those. You eat those. Mash and Archon spoke at the same time. The pair briefly looked at each other from across the room before returning their attention to Kat. Of course we do. Kat replied vigorously, they're good. They aren't. Archon commented as he stared at her. Hey, you be quiet. Kat called out, standing up and pointing at him with a clawed hand. You're just saying that because you can't appreciate the taste of it. Besides, which of the two of us is actually related to a sun god? I'm obligated to say me and I'm dreading whatever answer you can give. Niobe. I'm positive it's me. Archon remained stationary in his chair, everyone else getting the feeling as though he was staring off into the distance at nothing in particular. I'm in the service of a crossbreed and my employer is the holder of a lord soul and is insane. Sigward coughed and raised his hands, surely there is no need for violence. We are all of us enjoying a rather cordial conversation here and there is no need for food fight. Kat exclaimed, promptly materializing a plate of omuris from somewhere and holding it in her right hand, cocking the limb back and turning towards Ash and Sigward before hurling the plate towards them. Ash was only halfway out of his seat before the plate hit him square in the face. And then exploded in a ball of magical energy. The detonation at point-blank range blasted the table into pieces and caused Ritsuka to duck for cover as Mash raised her shield and protected the boy. Shards of wood impacting the shield as he let out a panicked cry. Ash was sent flying through the air, crashing into the wall behind him and going through it. Archon stood up in shock, staring at the new hole in the wall before turning in the direction of the remains of the table. Sigurd was on the floor, turning around and staring at the hole in the wall with wide eyes before they snapped back towards Tamamo cat. The cat chuckled before raising her hand into a fist. Score 1 for the cat. Strike. She then launched herself forwards at Mash, extending her claws and slashing at the shield with enough force that the girl let out a grunt in surprise. Cat flipped through the air, pressing her feet against Mash's shield and then kicking off the shield and into a roll away from her, sweeping out with the back of her hand and striking Kiyohime in the gut and sending her flying away from her. Cat struck several poses before grinning like a loon. Grand battle time. Kick in the boss music. Woof. She pointed at Archon. So sitting around on your tail. I'm a guard and you're my servant, so that means you also have to do what I say and fight them. Archon looked down at himself before looking up. I'm in a costume with no sword. What do you expect me to do? Throw some paws. Tamamo cat shadow boxed before she paused and shrugged, or throw some punches in your case. Meoow. She cried out as she launched herself back into the fighting once again, disappearing in a blur of speed. You are insane. Archon scowled before he looked around himself, then picked up a chair. Ash stumbled out of the hole in the wall, shaking his head and then looking up. Archon smashed a chair over his head, then grabbed the broken leg and swung it upwards into Ash's chin, sending him staggering back through the hole. Sigurd stared at the man with a dumbfounded expression before he rushed to his feet. Archon turned to him and swung the chair leg at the knight. Sigurd raised his left forearm and caught the attack on the limb and shattered the makeshift weapon, then countered with a straight right to the side of his head. The slightly taller man staggered with the blow ever so slightly, then drew his leg back and kicked Sigurd in the chest and launched him away. Flexing his arms, he brought forth his sword and shield, assuming a ready posture and charging forwards. Sigurd rolled back onto his feet, manifesting his greatsword and swinging it upwards at the same time Archon swung the pointed edge of his shield towards the Katarinan's head. The attack was parried upwards at the same time he thrust his longsword towards his leg. Sigurd widened his eyes and swept his arm across, clashing it against the flat of the sword and redirecting away from him. Archon moved forwards and slammed his helmet into Sigurd's face, causing the knight to recoil backwards. He made to charge forwards when he heard a cracking sound behind him. Archon rolled to the side just before a large axe slammed into the ground where he had been standing. Rolling back to his feet, he found himself staring at a chiseled greatsword made of obsidian. Ash ignited the sword with demon fire before swinging the sword towards the silver knight. Archon turned towards him and raised his shield as the sword made contact with his defense. He grunted as he went skating across the floor before he slid to a halt. Archon lowered his shield and stared at the sword with surprise. The knight jumped forwards, his butler suit shredded as his armor manifested in full. Ash raised the greatsword in a blocking motion as Archon fell upon him with an overhead strike with his sword. The saber grit his teeth and held his ground as the full weight of the silver knight bore down on him. Swinging the point of his shield up, Archon struck Ash in the gut with the punch and staggered him away, spinning on his ankle as he went for a slash towards his neck. Ash raised the black of the greatsword, blocking the attack before sliding the sword across the blade towards the knight. Archon raised the shield across his body, the burning sword slamming into his guard and chaos flames whipping at his armor as if they had a mind of their own. Archon grimaced and pushed the sword to the side, exposing himself as he did. Ash stepped into his guard, swerving his body to the side and crashing his shoulder into the Silver Knight's chest. Archon staggered back then stumbled to the side as Sigurd's greatsword slashed at his shoulder, the blade grazing across the armor and upwards towards his helmet. The attack slammed into his helmet resulting in a resounding thud of metal. The man released a grunt as he turned his body so that Ash and Sigurd were in his line of sight. His helmet moved left and right between the two of them, tensing his body and holding his shield out in front of him and his sword arm coiled back in preparation for a thrust. The pair in front of him leveled their great swords towards him. Archon tensed his body and then rocketed forwards, igniting his sword in lighting as he approached the pair and swung it towards them. Ash met the blow head-on, swinging Galvatine into the oncoming black and clashing against it. Divine lightning and chaos fire combated each other in a furious sparking. Each blessing seemingly trying to snuff out the other. Sigurd swung towards Archon's side, the knight raised his shield, blocking the attack and remaining fixed in place from the duo. His eyes narrowed behind his helmet as he stared at the pair, digging his feet into the ground as they started to try and push him back. There were many things that Fujimaru Ritsuka wanted to do in his life, or at the very least make an attempt to do in his life. One of those things was getting into a food fight. He had always heard of them and seen them in cartoons when growing up. Moments when someone would get a pie thrown into their face and the like. Although he did personally wonder how people avoided getting injured. Apples were a very hard fruit and taking one of those to the head would most definitely have hurt. Another thing he had wanted to do at some point was one of those movie stunts where a person throws themselves over a table action hero style. Not for any particular reason beyond a simple childhood fantasy of looking cool. As he threw himself head first over one of the food tables and landed in a heap on the floor, Ritsuka realized that there were some childhood wishes that were beautiful because you weren't meant to obtain them. He rolled onto his back and then kicked up at the table, flipping it over and sending the food scattering onto the floor. Ritsuka crawled forwards and then pressed his back against the flat of the table. Panting heavily, he turned around and crested his eyes over the table. They then widened and ducked down as a platter of meat went flying through the air where his head had been and splattered against the ground. The boy paled slightly when he saw the metal tray itself was embedded in the ground. "Are you all right, Anshin-sama?" Ritsuka released a yelp and looked to his left to find Kiyohime sitting next to him with a concerned look on his face. The boy released a sigh of relief and nodded his head at her. "Yeah, just fine." Coughing into his hand, he looked over the flipped table once again and caught sight of the battle between Mash and Cat still ongoing. Cat span around, her tail enlarging and bursting into flames and smashing into Mash's shield. The girl grimaced as she was shoved back before throwing herself forwards, raising her shield above her head and slamming it into the ground with enough force to break the tiles. Cat leapt back to avoid the strike. Mash pushed off the shield and rose into the air, flipping her body over the cross shield and swinging her leg down like an axe towards the girl. Tamamo smirked and threw her fist up, meeting the axe kick with an uppercut. Mash released a gasp as she was pushed back, flipping back over the shield. The moment Mashed feet touched the ground, she swung her leg forwards and kicked the shield, still stuck in the ground, towards Cat. The girl blinked and raised her arms up in a block, gasping as she was struck by the metal projectile and sent flying backwards. Only to land on her feet, smirking at Mash as the shield flew back to her hands. "Nyahaha. Didn't you know that cats always land on their feet? Woof. You keep barking though," Mash exclaimed with a look of shock. "Shouldn't you be meowing instead if you're a cat?" "Rawr. Cat can do whatever she likes." Taking in a deep breath, her eyes twinkled before she hunched her body forwards and opened her mouth, the back of her throat glowing a brilliant orange before it erupted forwards in a beam of light. Mash widened her eyes and raised her shield to block the attack. The beam struck dead center and washed over the metal surface before being redirected towards the ceiling, carving a burning line through it before dissipating. "Hey," Cat frowned, "you aren't supposed to block it." "Woof. Since when could she fire beams from her mouth?" Ritsuka called out, still hiding behind the table and pointing at her. "Where is that in the legends of Tamamo no Mae?" "You know about Tamamo no Mae?" "Not a lot, but I feel as though someone would have mentioned that she could fire laser beams from her mouth." "Ha ha ha." Cat merely laughed and threw several more punches in the air. "There's nothing a loyal maid can't do for her master." "What the heck does that even mean?" Ritsuka cried out with a look of bafflement. "How does being a maid give you the ability to shoot laser beams?" "Being a housewife lets me burn things," Kiyohime replied with an innocent expression before she frowned in the direction of Cat. "But there is such a thing as overcompensation." Cat frowned at her in response. "Hey, don't diss me, snake girl. I'll sharpen my claws on your kimono. Try it and see how far it gets you," Kiyohime called back before she took in a lungful of air. Cat whirled on her and leaned back, opening up her mouth and once again building up magical energy in the back of her throat. "Oh crap," Ritsuka realized as he scurried away from the table, crawling along the ground and hiding underneath another one as the two women threw their heads forwards and unleashed attacks from their mouths. A stream of fire erupted from Kiyohime's throat and launched itself towards Cat. At the same time, Cat unleashed a golden beam of light towards Kiyohime. The two attacks clashed against each other, fire and magical energy wrapped around their opposing force like a serpent before exploding outwards. The ground where the attacks had met was scorched black. Ritsuka watched the devastation before looking between the two battles, his eyes narrowed slightly before he nodded to himself, Ash. Mash. Swap. Kat was recovering from the initial attack when the hairs on the back of her neck screamed out in alarm. The servant rolled backwards just as Ash's greatsword passed through the air where she had been moments prior. Ash used the momentum of his swing to carry himself forwards, cocking his left arm back and throwing an overhead punch with his full body weight behind it. Kat widened her eyes before they narrowed, raising the flat of her paw and catching the fist in her hand. Ash blinked in surprise before she extended her claws and clamped down against the wrist. The curved fingernails pierced through his arms and earned a hiss from the saber, made worse when Kat twisted the arm and pulled it downwards while kicking off the ground, spinning her body sideways and slamming a kick into his collarbone and being rewarded with a dull thudding sound. Ash growled before the hand started to burn. Kat released the arm and jumped back as the palm exploded into black flames. Hey! Kat frowned at him, don't you know how sensitive my paws are? How would I be able to cook without them? Ash didn't say a word as he rushed in again, this time thrusting the sword forwards. The sword glowing a brilliant white for a half second before the light surged forwards, rushing towards Tamamo like an arrow. The cat kicked off the ground at the last second, cratering the floor beneath her and extending her claws out, stabbing into the wall and then climbing up it. Ash's head turned in her direction before he felt a buildup of heat behind him. He spared a glance over his shoulder to see Kiyohime form several orbs of fire and launch them forwards. Ash found it mildly disturbing how maneuverable the cat creature was, the woman virtually a blur of movement as she crawled across the ceiling and avoided the orbs of fire being launched at her, much to the obvious irritation of Kiyohime, who was clearly starting to tire at this point from the constant expenditure of magical energy. Narrowing his eyes, Ash stabbed Galvatine into the ground before going to his bottomless box and pulling out the sword spear of Farum. Grasping the weapon with both hands, Ash aimed it towards the ceiling before nodding to Kiyohime. "Get Ritsuka behind us," he told her. The berserker clearly didn't need much in the way of incentive as from the words, "Get Ritsuka," she was already rushing towards the master and grabbing him gently by the shoulder and leading him away. Kat stabbed her claws into the ceiling, using them as her anchor point, and then swung her body down so she was dangling from her arm, turning around to face the servants and then blinking when she saw the spear in Ash's hand glow with ominous gold light. "So where did you get a divine construct?" Kat asked as she tilted her head. "Those things aren't supposed to be wielded, oi," she cried out as she jumped away moments before a blast of gold lightning could strike her. Ash turned the spear and re-aimed it towards her, unleashing another blast of lightning from the weapon towards the girl as she continued to jump from point to point. "Go to a concert," she said. Ritsuka complained as Kiyohime dragged him behind the pair, wincing at the crackle of lightning and the thunderous crash of ceiling tiles being vaporized. "It'll be fun," she said. "Yeah, next time I'm planning the concerts. I don't see it ending any differently than right now," Romani helpfully supplied with a shrug, but then again, who could predict an ancient fox spirit showing up? Not helping Roman. Archon jumped forwards, thrusting his sword into the center of the cross shield and being rewarded with a heavy clang of metal. The knight grimaced as his blade skated downwards along the surface and to the left. Archon turned his body with the strike, raising his arm up and swinging it around like a club and slamming his shield into the side of Mash's. The girl remained stationary before she pushed backwards and Archon forwards. The knight then raised his sword as Sigward slammed his own weapon into it. Archon pulled his weapon back before going into a thrust. Sigward countered, batting the sword aside with his larger weapon and bringing it back around towards him. Archon raised his shield, catching the blow against the flat surface and then stomped forwards, shoving Sigward away and turning back towards Mash as she rushed in. The girl swung the great shield with freighting ease. He leaned back to barely avoid catching the base of the weapon against his cheek. For a moment it looked as though Mash had overextended herself as her body followed through with the strike and turned away from him. Then she leaned herself forwards and raised her right leg in a high kick. Archon grunted as she caught him in the gut and knocked him away from her. Using the power of her kick, he jumped off the ground to gain some distance and reevaluate his position. His expression was hidden behind his helmet much like the Katarinen, only Mash's face was visible and set in a visage of grim determination, her eyes darting towards Sigurd and then back to him. Mash rushed forwards, spinning her body around and then hurling the shield towards him, the metal rotating through the air as it approached. Archon widened his eyes behind his helm and ducked down to avoid the shield as it flew over his head. Mash jumped into the air, raising her left leg above her head and then swinging it downwards. Archon leaned back before contact, her heel slamming into the ground like a sledgehammer and cracking the tiles beneath her foot. The pair stared at each other in silence for half a second before Archon punched her in the face with the handle of his sword. Mash released a grunt as he knocked her away, wincing internally at the strange manner by which her head felt tougher than he had been expecting it to. Raising his shield to cover his head, he heard and felt the clang of Sigurd's sword colliding with his guard before he pushed back and swung towards the Katarinen. Sigurd stepped in close, raising her left hand and grabbing the longsword at the base of the weapon before it had enough time to pick up speed. Sigurd and Archon struggled with each other, Archon's shield keeping Sigurd's greatsword locked in pace against his own armor while Sigurd tightly grasped onto Archon's longsword and stopped it from moving, not even showing any sign of discomfort even as the grinding sound of metal scraping against metal filled their ears. Rapidly approaching footsteps caused Archon to snap his head to the side, his eyes widened in alarm behind his helmet as he watched Mash virtually sailing through the air towards him, her left hand cocked back and her hand clenched into a fist. Despite the fact she was about to punch him, her eyes were calm and collected, without a trace of emotion on her face. Archon would have praised the professionalism if he wasn't about to be on the receiving end of it. Thinking quickly, the knight stamped down on Sigurd's foot as hard as he could. Sigurd let out a gasp as he hopped on one leg, Archon shoved him away and managed to pry his sword free from the knight's grasp. Mash's feet thudded against the ground as she landed, her entire body swinging towards him with her fist rocketing towards his face. Archon swung sideways, using the face of his sword and aiming for the side of her head. Mash ducked down, the sword sweeping through nothing but air and launched her right hand towards his gut with her hand outstretched. Her palm slammed into his gut and earned a near inaudible grunt from the man. It was a strong blow but nothing debilitating. Archon cocked his left arm back, aiming his shield at her hand and swinging it downwards. He then noticed the flash of light in her right hand brightened considerably before he felt as though he'd been struck in the chest by a chaos demon. This time he released a much louder grunt of pain as he found himself catapulted away from the girl, vaguely noticing that she now had her shield in the hand she had struck him with. Another gasp worked its way from his mouth as he slammed into the wall behind him, feeling bricks crunch as the weight of his armor impacted it and finding himself wedged into the wall. He pulled himself free and raised his shield, watching as Mash rocketed towards him and thrust the bottom of the shield up towards his guard like a spear. The attack battered his arm wide. Worse was when the shield didn't stop in its uppercut motion and he became aware of the cross-section now rushing straight towards his chin. With no real room to maneuver, all he could really do was watch as the edge of the shield closed in on him. He heard the heavy clang of the cross guard striking his chin, then his head snapped back and buried itself in the wall, his feet briefly leaving the ground as it happened. Mash pulled the shield back, Archon staggered out of the hole. Then she spun on her heel and delivered a roundhouse kick into his gut and sent him crashing through the wall in a shower of dust and bricks and onto his back into the next room. The knight groaned as he rolled onto his side, shaking his head and pushing himself back onto his feet, albeit shakily, as he turned to face her. "I've been hit by chaos demons, girl." Archon rebuked her as he rolled his shoulder, staring at her without making an effort to move. "You will need to try harder than that too." Mash stepped to the side, allowing him to see what was behind her. He blinked as he saw Sigurd with his arm cocked back in a whirlwind spinning around his greatsword before he thrust it forwards, the gale shooting through the hole in the wall and taking with it all the bricks and ruins from his crash before it slammed into him like a hammer. Archon's feet left the ground and he experienced a moment of weightlessness before he went crashing through yet another wall and then across the length of the room and then colliding with the wall and denting it inwards. He had barely a moment to contemplate what just happened before the flying debris caught up with him and slammed into his body, burying him in rubble. Mash turned around to face Sigurd, then gave him a grateful smile and a nod. Sigurd nodded in kind before he paused and looked at the holes in the walls and the pile of rubble at the very end of them. You don't suppose we went too hard, do you? Mash blinked before she opened her mouth, peering around the corner and staring at the rubble once again. Squinting her eyes, she watched as several pieces of brick fell away and revealed Archon slumped against the wall, his head hanging low. The girl gave a pleased smile and turned back to the knight. He's unconscious, I believe. Ah, good. Sigurd nodded his head in response, then turned around and pointed towards the opposite end of the room. Then maybe we should help. Shish. It. Ash cried out in pain as Tamamo landed on his back and sunk her claws into his shoulder. The saber reached up to grasp at her only for the girl to throw herself over him, landing on the ground and rolling forwards. Dragging Ash with her before she got onto her feet and hurled him over her shoulders and into a table. Wood splintered and food went flying as Ash crashed through the bench with a grimace. He rolled back to his feet and ignored the puncture wounds in his body as he grabbed the sword spear with his right hand and thrust it upwards. Kat leaned back, smirking as the blade passed just above her face before she flipped and kicked upwards as she did so. Ash's aim went wide and the spear was almost pulled from his hands. The saber grimaced before he threw his left hand forwards and unleashed a blast of fire from his palm. Kat hissed at the proximity of the ominous black fires. She jumped back as Ash scrambled to his feet and chased after her, sweeping the sword spear towards her and almost catching her in the chest. Her agility was simply superior to his and she was hitting harder than him. Ash internally frowned. Most opponents he had faced weren't this savage in battle. Even mimics, while just as strong, weren't nearly this fast and could be outwitted. The simple truth was that when it came to close-range combat, he hadn't much practice in it. Swordplay and mid-distance was something he could handle reasonably well. A brawl just wasn't something one got into, not unless they wanted to end up dead. Kat hunched her body back preparing to pounce again as Ash thrust the spear towards her head. The girl leaned her body to the side as the spear went past. Ash twisted the weapon so the flat end was facing her and then channeled magical energy into it. The spear crackled with golden lightning, as if it were an electric flight trap. The lightning instantly rushed onto Kat. The berserker let out a loud squealing noise as her hair stood on end, lightning rushing over her before it exploded in a puff of smoke and sent her flying away from him and into the floor. Kat shook her head, her eyes dazed as her ear twitched occasionally with a burst of electricity. She blinked profusely, then shook her head and looked up as Kiyohime loomed over her with narrowed eyes before she took in a deep breath. Kat promptly paled and scrambled to her feet before Kiyohime breathed out a wave of fire onto the girl. Kat released a panicked cry as she scrambled away with her clothes on fire, rolling around on the floor to put out the flames and refocusing back on Kiyohime. The last thing she saw was a metal boot racing towards her face before her vision blacked out. Ash watched as the berserker flipped through the air before landing face first into one of the pudding trays scattered along the floor. When she didn't immediately make an effort to move, he allowed his shoulders to drop, wincing at the pain still haunting them. He looked at the injuries and frowned when he saw the puncture marks in his armor. This is becoming an unfortunate habit. He groaned to himself before shaking his head and looked back towards his bottomless box. He knew he still had some repair powder he could use for his equipment. He briefly paused to consider whether or not Da Vinci could attempt to make more or if he could show some to Pharaohs, given that she was more intimately familiar with his home equipment. Dismissing the notion for another time, he opened up his bottomless box and withdrew the small wooden bowl filled with a golden powder. Pinching some between his fingers, he held it atop the openings in his armor and sprinkled some of the powder over the openings and looked away as the fabric and metal started to knit itself closed, the armor reverting to its more pristine condition than from before the fight. It didn't mean there weren't holes in his body, but he could heal those easily enough in a few moments. He directed his attention towards Kat, noticing her still face down in the custard pie, occasionally twitching as a jolt of yellow electricity ran through her. He turned his attention towards the others, then pointed at her. She's unconscious. She is. Ritsuka called out, standing up from behind another he had used to hide before releasing a sigh. He directed his attention towards the other end of the room where Mash and Sigurd as they approached the trio. How did it go with the knight? He looked past the duo and raised an eyebrow at the hole in the wall. Went well. Sigurd nodded his head in response, throwing a thumb over his shoulder. It was a terrible shame to cross swords with a man whom I had shared a drink with, but he's still alive. He gave a sigh of relief. So, what do we do now? He nodded towards Kat. Do we wait for her to awaken or do we continue on? You could probably question her now. Romani stated through the communicator. I mean, that's assuming she has anything sensible to say. He added on with a strained expression before he looked towards the director. What do you think? Olga was standing behind Romani with a dull look on her face. She looked down at the man with a blank expression before looking back towards the screen and at Ritska. Take whatever choice you believe is right. That said, we know not how many more obstacles lie in your path through this location. Therefore either consult her or the knight. The knight is of preference considering he appears to be the most coherent of the two. Right, Ritska nodded his head, then looked towards Mash and Sigurd before looking past them once again. He's unconscious as well, isn't he? The pair nodded once. Sighing to himself, Ritska looked around before he found one of the chairs lying down on the floor. Moving over to it, he flipped it back onto its legs before sitting himself down. Guess we just need to wait to see which one of them wakes up first then, don't we? Quite right, too. The group turned as one to the familiar voice. Patches stood in the corner with a plate of food in his hands and a casual smile on his face. He noticed all their odd looks before he frowned and shrugged. What? Waste not, want not. He explained as he nodded towards the passed-out servant. She is hardly going to be complaining about it, and it would be a great shame if all this food went to waste when it could go towards a better purpose. Ritska stared at the man in silence before he looked back around at the table. Should we grab some of the fruit? Romani blinked before he gave Ritska a surprised look through the communicator. Are you suggesting we loot the castle for food? Just the fresh stuff. Ritska explained easily as he gestured around. They did say it was a banquet for us. It just makes this a takeaway situation. He grimaced as he looked at the foodstuff painting the walls and the floors. Besides, I think we've hit the point in time where some of it is beyond edible. Romani opened his mouth to respond before he promptly closed it again, looking over his shoulder at Olga for guidance. Take what you can. Fresh produce, she ordered, fruits and uncooked vegetables, cheese and bread. We can keep them refrigerated back in Chaldea and use them later. There is little sense in overlooking this opportunity. She paused. Also trade with Patches and see if you can get more materials from him. This time let me do the talking. Oh. Patches raised an eyebrow at her before a smirk came to his face. Someone who claims to have the right sort of discerning eye to find the treasures that lay within Patches' boutique of wonders. Well, far be it from me to dissuade you. He chuckled to himself as he picked up a bread roll and took a large bite out of it. I certainly hope you have something to trade. Ritska rubbed the bridge of his nose before he waved Ash over to him and then gave him the communicator. I'll handle food gathering, you and the director can go shopping. Ash stared at him with blank eyes, then looked towards Olga and Romani through the screen before giving a single nod of affirmation. Very well. He turned back in the direction of Patches and walked towards him. The man raised a single finger in Ash's direction to cue him to wait while he chewed. Okay guys. Ritska clapped his hand and stood back up. Food fight looting is a go. Grab what you can and find a bag. We'll send it back to Chaldea and then continue on our way once either. He stared at Tamamo Cat with a blank expression before his eyebrows rose in disbelief. Sorry. I'm really having a hard time believing she's an aspect of Tamamo no Mae. He looked around. I've been to the stone. The stone. Sigurd raised a lone eyebrow at him behind his helmet. The stone where she is supposedly sealed. Mash explained to him. It was said that the spirit of Tamamo no Mae became trapped in a stone which killed everyone who approached until a Buddhist monk exorcised her, leaving the stone behind as a memorial for her. She paused. Apparently it is also a popular tourist destination. People go to a stone that might kill them. Sigurd tilted his head in confusion. Whatever for? They don't really believe it will kill them. Ritska explained. A lot of this type of thing is considered mythology, so people don't think it's real. Sigurd stared at him. But it is real though, isn't it? It is. Yep. Ritska nodded his head, but they don't know that, so it's fine. Hey. He called out, smiling widely and ducking down behind one of the flipped tables. The other three stared at him with pensive expressions before he re-emerged, holding a large circle of cheese above his head with a look on his face as if he had found the Holy Grail. Cheese. What type? Sigurd asked, tiddling his head. Ritska blinked at him before he lowered his arms and stared at it. Yellow. Sigurd snorted before he stepped forwards. I'll have a look. I'm quite good at recognizing cheeses, even if I can't taste them anymore. He stopped next to the boy and removed his helmet, squinting at the block of cheese and narrowing his eyes. Just as I suspected. He turned around and said, it's Astor and gold. Mash stared at him with a blank look. We don't know what that is though. Our cheeses have different names. They do. Oh, right, yes, they do, don't they? Sigurd muttered to himself, then looked at the cheese again. In that case I do not know what to say. Let's just call it cheese and show it to Archer. Ritska sighed to himself, he'll probably know. He's good at this sort of thing. He nodded around to the others, see if we can find any bread and someone make a note to ask Archer if he can make crackers. Crackers. Sigurd tilted his head, some manner of food that cracks. Something like that, yeah. Ritska nodded, these little biscuit things but they aren't biscuits. Sigurd stared at him, I don't follow. I'm really not good at explaining food, am I? Don't worry, Anshin-sama. Kiyohime reassured him with a smile, your lack of knowledge in certain areas is just part of your charm. It means that there is always room for us to learn new things together. Right, Ritska idly replied as he waved his hand, then looked towards Kat as the woman released a faint groan. Looks like she's waking up. He shrugged, guess we're asking here. He then looked down at the cheese in his arms, also can someone take this? It's heavier than it looks. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. 104. Halloween. Ending. Halloween, the Singing Pumpkin Castle. Ending. So how is everything looking so far? You stuffed most of the food into a sack. Archon bluntly replied as he stepped through the hole in the wall, sheathing his sword and looking at Tamamo Cat, and did you truly betray her so easily? Hey, I've got a reputation to uphold. Woof. Cat growled back, placing her hands on her hips and giving the knight a chiding expression. Imagine if it got out that I lost the battle and lost the war instead. These guys won't even agree it was a draw. Because you were unconscious and face first in a pie. Ritska bluntly stated as he oversaw the looting of the food, turning to Kat and then wincing before he gestured to the top of his head. By the way, you've still got a little of it just here. He gestured to the back part of him. Kat froze before clicking her tongue. This is just great. She hissed in annoyance as she licked her paw and then started to wipe down the area which still had smears of custard in it. You know how long it takes to groom. Considering none of us are cats or have fur, I'm not even going to make a guess in regards to that. Ritska sighed, shaking his head and looking back across the room towards the direction of Ashen Patches. He could see the pair of them bartering for something while the director's face was visible and providing commentary. Shaking his head, he then turned his attention onto Archon. So what about you? He asked the Silver Knight. The pointed helm turned to face him and tilted ever so slightly in confusion. Ritska threw a thumb over his shoulder in the direction of Kat. She flat out admitted to betraying her master to help us, but I'm not sure about you. Archon grimaced behind his helm. She was the one who summoned me, and the master of this castle of freaks is a crossbreed. I hold no loyalty to her in the first place. He paused before giving a derisive grunt, a fitting turn of events. Ritska raised an eyebrow at the man before he pursed his lips. From what he knew from Ash and the others, Archon was a Silver Knight and from the same place as Havel, therefore some obvious dislike of dragons was to be expected. It didn't sit right with him, but for the moment he wouldn't make any comments about it and invite hostility where none existed. Besides, Archon wasn't a servant of Chaldea just yet, and Ritska knew he didn't have much authority over the man, just shy of having the servants beat the racism out of him. Which probably wouldn't work either. So, talk of Elizabeth aside for the moment, are you coming with us then? I am. Archon nodded his head in response, although I very much doubt you intend to slay her. The man looked over in the direction of Kiyohime, given how you are in the company of a crossbreed. Oh, Are you speaking of me? Kiyohime looked over to him before tilting her head. You seem more hostile than when we met in France. I tolerate your existence for the simple fact you are not of the dragons Lord Gwyn ordered us killed. Archon bluntly stated, do not mistake that restraint for kindness. Take care not to give me a reason to end you. For the moment let's try and remember that the fighting is over. Ritsuka cut in with a stern expression aimed at Archon, and that while we might not all be friends, there's no reason to start fights with anyone else. Considering how quickly they could escalate. Archon stared at him in silence for a few moments before he grunted and looked away, sliding his shield onto the holster on his back and crossing his arms. Ritsuka stared at him for a few more moments before he turned towards Sigward. So, how are we looking for food? We've gathered up most everything that is fresh or can be kept alive after a few days. Sigward replied in a jolly tone, holding up the sack. I feel as though I am carrying a bag of treasures. Now I'm having visions of Santa Claus. The master muttered and he rubbed the bridge of his nose. Sigward's body jolted in confusion before leaning forward slightly. I'm not getting into Christmas right now. Ritsuka chuckled, waving his hand. I'll explain later, and pray that it doesn't end in a disaster in itself. He sniffed before coughing. Anyway, once we finish up here we'll carry on towards the final room. He turned to Kat. There's no one else left, right? Niobe. Kat beamed at him. As you can imagine they saved the best guards for last. Naturally me and my trusty stooge. Stooge. Archon's head snapped over to her incredulously. You were the one who started a pointless brawl and spent most of the fight climbing around the walls like some manner of rabid beast and throwing food around like a child. He pointed upwards towards one of the chandeliers, still with a piece of chicken leg impaled upon one of the decorations. How are you the aspect of a goddess? Hey, I'm a cat. Woof. Tamamo defended herself with a frown before leveling an accusatory glare at Archon. At least I managed to hurt one of them. She pointed towards Ash. I got him with my claws. Who did you manage to hurt? I punched the shield girl in the face. Archon defended, earning a double take from Ritsuka who then looked at Mash in concern only to blink when he noticed she didn't have a single scratch on her cheek. Really? Kat drawled, then looked at Mash with a studious gaze, because I don't see anything even close to a scratch on her. She's got tough skin. Archon defended, besides, you had the easier opponents. I was fighting a knight of Katarina and another knight of equal skill, then there was the undead with the chaos sword. Hey, that was the one I wounded. Kat realized before smirking, so if I was able to wound him and you weren't, doesn't that make me more powerful than you? What? Archon blinked at her behind his helm, his whole body jerking in surprise at the outrageous statement. You said you were an aspect of a goddess. Of course you're supposed to be stronger than me. I'm just a knight. Exactly. Kat preened at the statement. I'm glad we managed to work out the pecking order. Woof. Archon pinched the bridge of his helm and shook his head, turning away from Kat and strutting away from her towards the far corner of the room. Ritsuka watched the man go before he exhaled and turned to Mash. I don't even know what is going on anymore. He exasperated tone of voice which matched the tired expression he was now wearing. The shielder matched his look with one of her own, looking equally exacerbated by the non-stop string of bizarre happenings and surprise encounters. What are the chances there is going to be another horrible surprise in store for us before we're done here? Mash winced ever so slightly. I'm sure it will be fine, senpai. She exclaimed with as much cheer as she could muster forced into her voice, although neither of them were truly convinced. Mash slumped her shoulders ever so slightly before giving the master a questioning look. Is Halloween normally this tiring, senpai? Really it depends. Ritsuka admitted with a shrug. Some people have Halloween parties and while I'm not entirely certain how many of them end in random fist fights, they certainly have their fair share of mishaps. Have you ever been to one? Not really. I knew people who went to them but I didn't really get into that sort of thing all that much. He dismissed with a wave of his hand. I went to a couple of Christmas parties but Halloween was mainly me staying at home, although I do recall one Halloween party I went to years ago when I was like 10. 11. Let me guess. Romani's face popped up on Mash's communicator, the man wearing a sly smile. You went dressed as a pirate. Ritsuka blinked at him. Actually I went as the RX-782 Gundam. He replied with a straight face, as best I could anyway. Most of it was actually just some old boxes I painted red and white. Giving a wry chuckle, the master scratched the back of his neck. It wasn't very good but I had fun. Huh. Romani blinked, leaning back into his chair and staring at the master with a hint of surprise. With how you were like around the pirates, I thought you would have gone dressed as one of them. I didn't take you for a mecha fan, Fujimaru-kun. I have a variety of interests. Ritsuka replied with a wave of his hand. What about you? Aside from VTubers, that is. Ha. Romani gave a laugh drier than the Sahara. I actually have a passing interest in magical girls, I'll have you know. Ritsuka snorted. I'm really not surprised. He paused before he gave the man a concerned look. When you say magical girls, you don't mean Madoka. Nope. Romani gave him a 1,000-yard stare. Not at all. Just classical for me. Sailor Moon. Theme tune is catchy. That it is. Mash looked between the two of them with a bewildered expression. To her it was as if they had started speaking in an entirely different language and she hadn't received a translation for it. Senpai. What, Ritsuka stared at her before he gave a small noise of understanding. We're talking about anime. Mash still gave him a blank look. Not even that, Ritsuka muttered to himself before looking at Romani. You seem like a man who keeps Sailor Moon DVDs in his room. Why do I give you that impression? Romani sputtered. We're a secret scientific, human preservation organization in the middle of an undisclosed location. I'm working as a doctor. Why would I have the complete box set of the original Sailor Moon anime in my room with all 200 episodes and the 3 TV specials? Ritsuka gave him a raised eyebrow. Okay, maybe I do have them somewhere. Romani coughed into his hand, pointedly ignoring the snickering that was happening in the command room behind him from those who overheard his blunt confession. But why is that a bad thing? In this case it gives us something. Ritsuka pointed at him, then at Mash. We're gonna have to introduce her to Sailor Moon. Well, I'm not against it but why? Why not? It's like the archetype magical girl. Why are you talking about women casters? Mash asked with a baffled tone of voice as she looked between the two of them once again, her voice containing a hint of pleading as if to be clued in. Senpai. Doctor. Maybe Romani can go as a magical girl for Halloween. Da Vinci's voice mirthfully called through the communicator. I'm sure I can whip up a mystic code. Romani sputtered. Leo. That is I'm not a girl for starters. Yes, that is a big problem. Her voice contained a knowing tone to it which had Romani feel a sense of dread. Unless of course we had a servant who possessed a mystic code that could change genders. But we don't. Romani was cut off by Ritsuka holding his hand in front of his mouth and laughing into his palm. His eyes closed shut as he looked away from the doctor's growing expression of panic. Fujimaru-kun. Why are you laughing like that? Fujimaru-kun. What is that idiot screaming about now? Olga muttered as she looked over her shoulder in the direction of Romani frantically calling out through the monitor on the opposite end of the command room. The woman continued to stare at him before shaking her head and returning her attention to the individuals in front of them. Get the phoenix feather as well. 10 of them. 10 you say? Patches nodded, a fair number that requires a fair payment. He turned to Ash with his trademark smirk. Ash wordlessly handed over the required plastic decorations. A pleasure doing business with you, chum. He grinned as he took the currency and placed it in his own bottomless box. Ash took the glowing feathers in his hand, using his other to pick up one of them and study it closely. One of the few things unkindled were capable of feeling was warmth, and the feather offered merely a flicker of that. However, it was still enough that he could sense it. Be careful with those, Olga told him sternly. Phoenix feathers are rare and very useful in the crafting of rituals and spells. Ash grunted in response, gently placing the feather back with the others and then moving them into his own bottomless box before he looked back up. You had other items. Bits and pieces. Patches replied with a half-smile as he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms in front of his chest. Depends on what you're looking for. He raised a hand before twisting it around and revealing a dark-colored skull in his hand with glowing white eyes. Something for a spot of trouble. Olga frowned. What on earth? An alluring skull. Ash informed her with a straight face. Shattering them releases their essence, which is useful for attracting the attention of creatures and hollows. They are drawn to the power. I used them frequently to disperse crowds and fight through. His eyes moved away from the skull and back onto the man. I was unaware that there could be any left with the fall of the cathedral. I have my ways. The director stared at the skull, then looked at Ash with a raised eyebrow. Well, large crowds of enemies which might delay time. Alternatively, if one was looking to sneak past or cause a distraction. Ash informed her, I have been told that presence concealment is useful for spying. This might be used by assassins to cause havoc when faced with large gatherings. Olga hummed in response, cupping her chin and nodding her head. You might be right about that. Get one, we'll have Da Vinci analyze it and see if she can work up a method of copying them. Good luck with that. Patches chortled, then nodded to Ash. He knows why. Olga looked back at the saber expectantly. The skulls are made with dark magic. Ash replied with a slight frown. Made with the deep, an essence of the dark, and can only be crafted by one who was taught in the arts. I am capable of slinging abyssal pyromancies, but that does not make me a craftsman. Then we would need someone who was taught dark magic to create more? Most likely. As well as a supply of human skulls. Sighing to herself, Olga rubbed her eyes before waving her hand and giving a tired nod. Fine, fine, get 3, just in case. Pumpkins this time. Patches replied with a wide smile, pleasure doing business. I'm sure. Ash replied with a dry voice as he supplied the payment and took the skulls. How long before you attempt to kill us again? I'm almost hurt you'd ask that. Patches placed a hand over his heart with a hurt expression. It's these places that I travel to. They have horrible effects on a person, but once I'm there long enough the madness leaves me. He gestured between the two of them. See. We converse like old friends now that I've been here long enough. Ash stared at him in silence before he went back to placing the skulls in his box and closing the lid shut. What else? Something rather special. Patches smirked at him before reaching into his box and pulling out an ashen-colored square stone with the shape of a skull emboldened on the front of it. Ash's eyes widened slightly before they narrowed. I knew you'd recognize it. Where did you get this? I travel. Patches smirked, holding the stone with one hand, useful item despite its nasty history. What is it? Olga asked as she narrowed her eyes, and what is with this theme of skulls? A purging stone. Patches chuckled as he waved the stone in the air. If you should ever find yourself cursed, just use this little thing and you'll be right as rain. Olga blinked. It cures curses. Sure, we'll go with that. Patches shrugged. I doubt you'll find the truth much appealing. I am not using that. Ash bluntly declared. Patches stared at him in silence for a few moments before he shrugged and returned it to its spot, the director giving him an irritated look. He just holds up something that can cure curses and you say no? Are you in? It does not cure the curse, it transfers it. Ash informed her as he turned to stare at her, and curses might only affect living things, or at the very least, beings who possess a soul. He nodded towards Patches. That stone does not just possess the face of a skull. It possesses the soul of a man. The director stared at him for a few moments before her face went paler than usual and her eyes widened. What? The monument in the ringed city was far more gruesome. Ash turned to Patches with a scowl. Thousands of bodies lay at its base. Their souls warped into the ability to hold curses even after death. Patches merely shrugged. I didn't build the thing, so there's no point baring your fangs at me. Ash sighed and turned back to her. Curses can be dealt with in other fashions that do not involve abusing the souls of the dead. Least of all transferring more pain onto them. They have suffered enough. I would rather they not suffer anymore. All right. Olga swallowed before shaking her head and composing her expression, although she still looked slightly sickly after the reveal. Ash turned back to Patches and crossed his arms at the man. I shall suppose you have other items that might prove useful that do not come from the pain of others? That's a bit hypocritical coming from you, isn't it? Patches replied with a raised eyebrow and a smirk, then raised his hands in surrender when Ash's eyes hardened. I joke. No need for all that. Lowering his hands, he placed them back on his hips and hummed to himself. I do have some other items that you might find interesting, some fruits and plants. I suppose you can work with those, can't you? The type used for curing poisons or restoring stamina. Patches gave a single nod in response. They will do. Curing poisons? Olga shook her head and turned towards Ash with a more serious expression. Specific poisons or a general treatment? Any sort of poison. Patches offered with a merchant's grin. From the director's perspective, the man was akin to a snake oil peddler. Never met one that it didn't have a problem curing. He raised a single finger. Now I know Patches sounds like he's exaggerating it, but this is quality stuff. Hard to get but definitely treasured. Then why would anyone bother with poisons? Because most can just cure it with spells. Patches shrugged, and most other poisons are so fast-acting that you're dead before you can get to a mage who could cure you. An ugly snort came from his mouth. Or a cleric, but good luck trying to get one of them to heal you and still having anything in your coffers afterwards. Your cheapest item, I assume? Patches merely gave him a knowing smirk. I would recommend getting some. Ash nodded towards the director. I have some of the different plants already in my bottomless box, however it is preferable to have surplus now rather than fall short when we find ourselves in a position where it is useful. Olga pursed her lips then nodded her head. Excluding the possibility of a servant using poison as a special skill or a noble phantasm. There are many assassins who could use such things. How many leaves do you want? Patches asked as he raised up the purple clump of moss, or for extra. He revealed in his other hand the purple clump of moss with white flowers blooming from it, for those rare times? Do the flowers make a difference? The flowered variety cures toxins as well. Ash informed her with a curt response. More effective but much rarer. He looked at Patches, and more expensive? Patches smiled in response. Some of us have to eat, you know? I'm not trying to fleece you, honest. Ash merely hummed in response before looking at the white-haired woman. Olga remained silent for a few moments before she nodded once at him. Get the blooming variety. I will see if we can convert one of unused storage rooms into a botany lab. Keeping and growing some of these plants would be much more beneficial than having to wait. Turning back to Patches, Ash handed over 60 candles to the man, receiving 3 moss clumps. The saber placed the plant in his box before turning back to Olga's screen. We're almost out of funds and I doubt we have enough to buy anything more of value. The woman merely grunted in response. It is still a better position than before we came down here. She clicked her tongue and looked over her shoulder at Romani's raised voice. What on earth could you possibly be yelling? The woman did a double take and then walked away from the screen. Ash raised an eyebrow at the muffled voices before the woman came storming back and stared at him with wide eyes. What's this I hear about you swapping genders? Patches snorted once. We're not going to turn you into a magical girl, Roman. Ritska placated the man with a soft tone, raising his hands and waving the panicked man down. You promise. I promise. All right, Romani coughed into his hands. Gee good. I probably wouldn't make a very good magical girl anyway. I'm sure you'd be a very attractive woman, Romani, Da Vinci sang across the room with a pleased look in her eyes. Besides, being a woman is rather exciting. She gestured to herself, speaking from experience, of course. Not all of us are as adventurous as you, Leo. Romani shot back with a tired expression before looking back at Ritska. So, you got all the food then? Just about, yes. He looked back at Kat. You're not going to complain about this, right? It was baked for the guests. Kat shrugged her shoulders, rolling back and forth on her furred feet. What's wrong with turning a banquet into a takeaway? Woof. Fair enough. Shrugging to himself, he turned back to Romani. Sigward's got the sack of food and I assume the director is now grilling Ash about the rings. Something like that. Romani replied as he looked to his side with a wry smile. I think she's more baffled as to why he has it to begin with. I asked him the same thing. Really? What did he say? He just said, why not? And left it at that. Romani opened his mouth to reply before he paused and slowly closed it again. I can't think of an answer as to why you wouldn't have one. Me neither. Has he ever? Once. I see. Yep. Did he say what? He said he was top heavy. Alright, sure. Would you ever? I am seriously considering it. Ritsuka quietly admitted with a shrug of his shoulders, placing his right hand on his hip while his left held the communicator, if only because I was curious as to what it's like being a woman. You know. Romani squinted slightly before he gave a slow reply. Can't say that I do, but Leo would be the one you'd want to ask for that. He paused, she'd 100% tell you to go ahead though. Telling me. Ritsuka chuckled to himself before looking towards Mash and seeing her staring at him with an odd look in her eyes. Something wrong. Huh. Mash blinked before shaking her head, and no. I was just thinking of what Senpei would look like as a girl. Her eyes became distant before they gleamed with a spark. Girl Senpei. What the heck are you filling her head with, Fujimaru-kun? Romani turned on the boy with a shocked expression and an accusatory tone. Wah. How am I to blame for this? Myself and Olga have completed the collection of supplies and are ready for us to depart further into the. Ash spoke as he approached, unaware of the chaos he was strolling into, striding past Archon with the pair not even offering the other a nod. Senpei, in a dress. Ash paused and stared at Mash as she whispered to herself in an almost hesitant tone, her eyes betraying some semblance of personal shame before she clapped her cheeks twice. His eyes drifted away from the girl and towards Romani and Ritsuka, both of whom looked as though they had no idea how to approach the situation. He then looked to Olga, the woman merely blinking repeatedly before she turned to him and merely stared. Right, Ritsuka stared at the door in front of him before he turned to Tamamo Cat, you're sure this is the last door? Second to last, Cat responded, although this room is supposed to be empty. Lizard Girl is waiting further on. And you're certain nothing is in this room? Ritsuka asked as he pointed at it. Nothing at all. I'm not going to fling these doors open and get assaulted by the mummy. Why would your mother attack you? Sigward asked in a shocked tone as he stared at the young master. My word, are you alright? Mummy, not. Ritsuka pinched the bridge of his nose. It's a type of monster. Wrapped in bandages. A zombie. Oh. Sigward nodded his head in understanding. Why do you call them mothers then? Fairly certain there's nothing beyond these doors. Woof. Cat exclaimed with a confident smirk. I would stake his life on it. She remarked, pointing towards Archon, the knight doing a double take when he saw the claw pointed at him. The man stared down at the hand in obvious shock, arms loosening from their crossed position before they fell to his sides. Why my life? Because it's not mine. All right then. Ritsuka ignored the chaos behind him as he placed his hands on the two doors and took in a deep breath. Turning his head towards Mash, he nodded to her once. You ready, Mash? Ready, Senpei. Mash nodded her head before her cheeks dusted with a speck of redness. Also I'd like to apologize for the, bit about the dress, Senpei. It's fine. Ritsuka dismissed easily before he threw the doors open, then promptly paused and paled. Everyone else stared at the room full of skeletons with baffled expressions. The skeletons stared back at them. The peculiar thing was that none of them were armed with any sort of weapon and several of them were on all fours in a bench position in front of other skeletons. Fujimaru-kun. Romani whispered to him through the communicator, is it a bad time to say I'm picking up a reading of divinity? Your wa. Ritsuka had barely enough time to speak before noticing a large black shadow moving across the ground with seemingly nothing casting it. The dark mass moved into the center of the room before it slowly rose up as if emerging from water. The eyes of everyone slowly trailed up as what looked like a mass of bones emerged from the black mass. Several dozen skulls morphed along the surface before halting, all of their heads facing forwards with the largest among them resting at the top of the pile. A creaking sound echoed throughout the room as the mass continued to rise up. A loose collection of bony limbs dangled down like a horrible curtain and covered the front of the torso as the being hunched over. The shadow had risen with the creature, rolling over their body like a waterfall onto the ground with a faint luminescence to it. By the finish, the creature was easily the size of Heracles, if not slightly taller. Ah, visitors. At last. The voice was rich and ethereal, as if coming from somewhere behind the mass of bones. A single hand rose up from the left side of the dark cloak and gestured to them. We have been waiting for you. Really? Ritsuka squeaked. Gee, glad we could make it. I'm sure. The skulls never once opened their mouths as the voice spoke, the massive heads scanning the individuals in front of them before falling onto Tamamo Cat. "And what brings you into such a form, Lordess of Light?" The voice asked with a tinge of amusement. "Much as I prefer the dark, seeing this body of yours is almost worth stepping forth into the rays of the sun." A haunting chuckle emerged from the being, if only for the amusement it represents. "Hey, when you say it like that it sounds like you're making fun of me." Cat called back before rolling her arms. "You spoiling for a fight, huh?" The skulls stared at her in silence before they moved past her and towards Ash and Sigward. Ritska felt as though the temperature of the room, which had already been rather chilly, abruptly plummeted. "Undead." The being spat out the word with disgust. "Well, at least not anymore." The hand pointed at Sigward before moving past him towards Ash. "For you, it seems we are forced to await that outcome for but a little while longer." The large being moved further down the line before stopping upon Kiyohime, a crossbreed. How curious, and one so young. Yet without the touch of divinity, a mixture of dragon and human. How quaint. It moved onto Mash, so young, and so fleeting. Then onto Archon. Well, the being rumbled in amusement. What business does a Silver Knight of Gwyn have with such exotic companions? Did you tire of the company of your fellows? They paused before their skulls all seemed to focus on them, or mayhaps it revolves around that essence of chaos deep within your being. The heads finally moved onto Ritska. How curious. Not but a human. Hi. Ritska coughed into his hand, putting on a polite smile and waving at the rather imposing skeleton. "Fujimaru Ritska, and you are." A pregnant pause followed, soon ending when the voice rumbled with a chuckle. "How daring." They pointed a single hand towards Archon when it looked like they were going to berate the boy. "I shall allow his tone, Knight of Light. I find it most amusing." Archon stepped back, although still looking visibly shaken. "For now though, I will adhere to the one reason I came to this place." The mass of bones melted back into the floor before the shadow swam across the tiles before the being rose up again behind an object made from bones. Two hands came out from beneath the cloak, both holding large bones as they moved towards the large ribcage in front of them. Then the skeletal being started to tap away at the ribs, forming musical notes in an odd pattern. Ritska's eyes nearly bulged out of his skull when he recognized the tune. The bafflement grew when he saw the other skeletons in the room abruptly start strutting from side to side in step with each other, their hands curled into fists and placed upon their hips. Spooky, scary skeletons send shivers down your spine. The eyes of everyone went from the dancing skeletons to the large figure cloaked in black shadows, their deep voice holding a hint of musical theme to it which caused everyone to nearly collapse at the sheer absurdity of it. "Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight." Is this actually happening? Ritska whispered to himself in shock as he watched the skeletons link hands and then dance around in a circle. From the disbelieving stares of everyone to the left and right of him he could, at the very least, confirm that he wasn't hallucinating. Spooky, scary skeletons speak with such a screech. You'll shake and shudder in surprise when you hear these zombies shriek. Ritska leaned back as a skeleton rolled past him with what looked like the wooden wheel of a cart embedded in its body. The master raised an eyebrow as it was then joined by another one which proceeded to circle each other while rolling along the ground before splitting off towards opposite ends of the room. All the while the skeletons were still dancing or now playing bony instruments. "We're so sorry skeletons, you're so misunderstood." The lighter voice had them turn to another individual who was in the corner. The man had pale blue skin with dark red eyes, wearing a chainmail tunic and shoulder-length silver hair flowing down from his head. "You only want to socialize, but I don't think we should." The man's voice was crisp when compared to the deep tone of the skeletal giant and yet equally rich in tone. "'Cause spooky, scary skeletons shout startling, shrilly screams. They'll sneak from their sarcophagus and just won't leave you be." The large figure unveiled another hand from under their cloak, this time coming from the mound of bones that served as their torso with another bone held in its grip. The three limbs worked on playing the solo piece on the pseudo-xylophone which had everyone utterly unsure of what they were even supposed to do in the first place. "R. Roman," Ritska whispered to the man as his eyes danced to all the skeletons in the room. "Hey, are you recording this?" "Why yeah. Good, just making sure so we have proof we're not all crazy." "All right." Spirits supernatural or shy, what's all the fuss? Several skeletons fell into a pile on the floor, rolling around on the ground before coming to a half. But bags of bones seem so unsafe, it's semi-serious. The pile of bones dragged themselves along the ground and locked themselves back together, rising up and forming a complete skeleton once again before the group went about resuming their dance as if nothing had ever happened to them in the first place. Spooky, scary skeletons are still all the same. They'll smile and scrabble slowly by and drive you so insane. The large figure resumed singing, seemingly enjoying their amusement if the curling of the skulls on their body into smiles was any indication. Sticks and stones will break your bones, they seldom let you snooze. Spook, scary skeletons will wake you with a boo. The group jolted at the sheer power behind the final word which seemingly shook the entire room with its bass. The skeletons slowly stopped dancing as the music faded away. The bony xylophone the giant had been playing abruptly stood up and revealed itself to be the skeleton of some manner of bear before it blooded off and vanished into dust. The other skeletons soon followed through with their counterpart, disappearing without a trace. The tall blue man remained stationary for a few moments before he grunted and closed his eyes. His body vanished into golden motes of light indicating he had been a servant and was departing the singularity. What? Ritska spoke in a shocked tone. The Romani followed through. Heck, Olga finished with a choking sound. This was, what? It seems I have overstayed my welcome. The large being rumbled, their hands disappearing back under their cloak. This passing moment of amusement has left me satisfied. They chuckled to themselves as they turned away and started to melt back into the floor. Perhaps we shall meet again, mortals. They vanished into the ground without a second word. The shadow swam across the tiles before disappearing underneath one of the doors and leaving them alone in the room. Does anyone want to explain what that was? Ritska eventually asked after a few moments, his eyes wide and looking around. No, seriously. What the heck was that? That was simultaneously one of the best and one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. He looked around. Anion, why are you so tense, Ash? Ash blinked, looking at Ritska and then noticing his hand had been on the handle of his sword. He pulled it away in surprise. I do not know. I merely felt that being in his presence was akin to a life or death situation. Yes, Sigward nodded in response, giving a shaky breath, as if all it would take for him to end me is just to make eye contact. A rather frightful fellow indeed. Well, he was a spooky, scary skeleton. Ritska offered with a chuckle, being rewarded with groans for the lame pun. Fine, he smiled, shaking his head and turning back around. I'm actually in a good mood now. Whatever that was. That was scary is what that was. Romani blurted out as he stared away from the screen and at one of the monitors. Fujimaru-kun, that person was a divine spirit and a powerful one as well. Hey, these readings easily exceeded those of the writer in France 203-fold. Romani exclaimed as he looked back at the boy, probably more. They were probably a very powerful god wherever they came from, and the skeletons leave little to the imagination as to what they were the god of. Ah, right. Ritska coughed into his hand and nodded his head. He just sang a Halloween song. Roman. The boy shook his head, cradling his forehead in his hands. I'm going to struggle to take him seriously. I would. Archon spoke in a strained tone of voice. That was Lord Nito. First of the dead, and if he wished it, he could have killed all of us with but a wave of his hand and we would have been unable to stop him. Ritska stared at him. Well, that's grim. Stop with the puns. Olga berated him with a shocked look. This is serious. Right. Yes. Of course. Ritska nodded his head at her seriously before biting his lower lip. As serious as bags of bones. The woman glared. I'll stop. Ritska stared at the final door. Through here then, is she? He asked Kat, raising an eyebrow at her. Kat nodded her head and walked past him, pulling him back and placing him with the others and putting her hands on her hips. Hey, Red Lizard, Kat called out as she slammed her fist on the door 3 times in a loud knock. Are you ready yet? Wah, who are you calling a lizard? I'm a dragon. A young female voice called back. Ritska looked at the others with a raised eyebrow before turning back in the direction of the door. And I'm nearly done. Just give me a second, okay? Ritsuka placed his hands on his hips and furrowed his brows. We've spent an entire evening fighting through a castle and she still isn't ready yet. He asked himself, rolling his jaw before he pursed his lips. Why not? Some of these things take time, Fujimaru-kun. Romani offered with a shrug of the shoulders before he paused. That being said, if I were you I'd be thankful that she isn't ready yet. Small miracles and all that. We're going to have to listen to her anyway, Roman. Actually we've got to turn the microphone of the communicator off to conserve power. Romani replied with a strangled tone of voice and a facial expression that made it plain as day he wasn't being entirely truthful. Why you know? No, I don't. Ritsuka narrowed his eyes. Explain it to me. Well, okay. Elizabeth's muffled shout came from behind the closed doors. I'm ready, you can come in now. Oh boy, would you look at that. Romani loudly called out in a forced tone before he pressed a single button and the screen shut off. Ritsuka glared at the communicator before lowering his wrist. That guy, all right, Ash, get the door. Ritsuka waved his hand, his brain catching up with what he had said a second later, his eyes widening. No wait. Biwa. Elizabeth's panicked voice followed when Ash grabbed the door by its handle and ripped it from its hinges, hurling it behind him and then pausing. What the heck are you doing here? Why would you do that to my door, you pig? Are you thick? Where is puppy? That's my bad. Ritsuka called out from behind Ash, poking his head through the door and then blinking in surprise when he saw Elizabeth. Nice outfit by the way. Elizabeth opened her mouth to reply before she paused, a wide grin splitting her features as her body puffed up with pride. Of course it is. An idol must exemplify whatever theme they have decided upon. The girl wore a frilly dress with a blue and orange pattern, a black shoulder coat with a neon orange underside and long black gloves which extended up her arms. Sitting atop her head was a large pointed hat which looked as though it had been pulled from Beatrice's wardrobe. Her smile diminished when everyone else filed into the room as well, blue eyes narrowing when they caught sight of Kiyohime. What are you doing here, belly dragger? I'm looking after my Anshin-sama from those who might wish him harm. Kiyohime defended before she looked around the room with narrowed eyes. This is Senpai's room. Mash blinked as she looked around and frowned. Wait, how did we get here? She paused and narrowed her eyes at the display. And what is with all this mess? Why is my room filled with pumpkins? Ritsuka asked as he looked around, then stared at the ceiling. Is that bunting as well? Well, obviously. Elizabeth replied as if the answer had always been clear. It's a Halloween concert, so there would naturally be appropriately themed decorations. She explained, while you were all away fighting, I was busy using the Grail to redecorate. Ritsuka paused. Are we back in Chaldea? Well, I linked space together to bring you here, yeah. Elizabeth shrugged. Well, are you surprised? She asked with an eager expression as she looked around at the faces. Well. Ritsuka blinked and looked around before turning back to Elizabeth and raising an eyebrow. Well. The girl slumped. Are you surprised? I'm surprised at this intrusion into my husband's room. Kiyohime commented with a noticeable frown but with a hint of puzzlement in her tone. But what are you referring to? Not the room. Elizabeth snapped at her, then threw her arms wide and grinned. 'Twas I who sent the mysterious invitation that summoned you all here. That was supposed to be a secret. Ash asked with a raised eyebrow as he stared at her. Elizabeth did a double take at him, eyes widening and shoulders slumping. What? Elizabeth looked struck by the statement. What do you mean? I went through the trouble of leaving the invitation unsigned. I summoned servants to act as my proxies and entertainers. I even went through the effort of changing my look. She waved her hands around, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. How are you not surprised? Scratching the back of his neck, Ritsuka gave a half shrug. You have a very specific style that makes it easy to tell it's you. He responded with, that's basically it. He winced. Sorry. Elizabeth paused, seemingly mulling over something in her mind before she crossed her arms and pouted. Well, I don't know if I should be happy that I'm already iconic enough that you can spot me out or annoyed that you ruined the surprise. She remained silent. It's hard being famous. Not that famous. Kiyohime countered swiftly. However, I have but a single question for you. She pointed the fan at Elizabeth and narrowed her eyes. And you will answer. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Will I? All right then. Why did you have us fight all those servants on our way here? Kiyohime asked. Each one of them was tasked with battling us. Why? I was wondering that. Mash quietly supported with furrowed brows. Don't get your hopes up. Ritsuka muttered to her in an equally quiet voice. I can feel the headache coming on. Mata Hari, Carmilla, Seldora, Uncle Vlad. Uncle. Ritsuka repeated the word with a hint of incredulity. Some weird rat, Tamamo cat and that rude knight who tried to cut my head off when we first met. She narrowed her eyes at the final figure. Archon merely grunted from the back of the group and looked away from her. They're all powerful servants who fought you with everything they had. So now you must be tired, right? Probably a little. Ritsuka admitted with a shrug, crossing his arms in front of his chest before he paused. What about the skeleton man? He snapped his fingers as he tried to remember the name. Nito. Lord Nito. Archon supplied, first of the dead. Yeah, what about him? Elizabeth blinked at him profusely. Who? You had no idea he was here, did you? Who was here? The girl asked as she looked at each of them in confusion. Was there someone here I didn't invite? Let's just set that aside for the moment. Ritsuka held out his hands as if he were grasping a box and then shifted them to one side as if moving something. You were saying about us being tired. Elizabeth shook her head. Yes, I was. Coughing into her hands, her smile returned in force. An exhausted band of travelers, tired from their long and arduous journey, finally stumbled across paradise where they find. She trailed off dramatically, eyes shining with excitement. Kiyohime delicately raised an eyebrow. Where they find? They find happiness. Elizabeth exclaimed with a cheer. That's right. They find the bluebird of happiness right beside them. She pointed at herself. It's me. I'm the bluebird. Your reward for this achievement is a one-night-only concert with me. There was a pause before the grin widened, and I shall sing loud. Her eyes darted between each of them. Well, aren't you happy? You're moved to tears, aren't you? Aren't you? Ritsuka stared at her in silence for a moment before he raised a single finger. Excuse me a second. He turned around, gently wading through the small crowd in the room before stepping into the hallway, his voice dropping into something just quiet enough that only his intended target could hear him. Roman, I know this communicator is still on. Get us out of here now. There was no response. Roman. Unfortunately, the super senses of servants made the entire act of whispering pointless as they all heard him anyway. Oh. Elizabeth looked past the group at Ritsuka. Is Puppy trying to invite more people? He can't do that. This is supposed to be a special concert. Where are you going? She directed the question to Ash. The servant paused with one foot already out of the door. Anywhere but here. Ash bluntly stated as he continued on, stepping out into the hallway and crossing his arms. He had already experienced her singing once and he was far from inclined to suffer it again. Archon similarly took several steps back and carried himself out of the room and into the hallway. Visions of her opening act at the Narafest and the subsequent deafening experience that left him bleeding from the ears played on repeat in his mind. 3 individuals now stood in the hallway. Ash leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes closed while Archon paced around. Ritsuka was still hunched over the communicator and hissing at it, trying to get Romani's attention. Mash watched the display with a strained expression before she turned back to Elizabeth. See, couldn't you have just done this concert at Chaldea without using a Holy Grail, Elizabeth-san? Ha! Elizabeth stared at Mash dubiously. Why would I do that? That's boring. Shaking her head, she assumed a teaching pose. An idol's concert is supposed to be an event, right? Something that you brave the winter snow and the summer heat to even have the chance of attending. Their songs are supposed to be anticipated with every fiber of your being, to be quested for. The girl sighed. If I had just shown up in Puppy's room and started singing to him, I would have been a demon, right? Mash very wisely decided not to answer that question. Sigward raised his hand. So this entire adventure was a passage to this concert. Exactly. Elizabeth beamed at the man. Aren't you also happy? Sigward remained silent as he lowered his arm before he turned around and walked into the hallway. Elizabeth's features faltering slightly at his departure as she looked around with a confused expression bordering on hurt. Is something wrong? Is everyone ill? Ritska rubbed his brow, shaking his head and eventually giving a tired sigh. We're gonna have to listen to her song, you know. Must we? Ash asked, face showing discomfort at the idea of sitting through another of her songs. Right now, I'm tired of fighting and would just like this to be over. Ritska replied to him, placing his hands on his hips and exhaling, and Roman isn't going to answer the communicator until we're done, and she went through all this effort. Is effort how you measure quality? Archon asked with a strained tone of voice, because if that is the case, if I were you, I would reevaluate how I determine quality. This probably isn't one of those times. Ritska looked over his shoulder, wincing when he saw Elizabeth's expression. Sometimes I really do hate being me. I just can't ignore that face. I could. Archon bluntly commented with a grunt. As could I. Ash supported it with a flat expression. Yes, well, I can't. Ritska muttered before he walked back into the room, putting on his best smile. All right, Elizabeth, hit us with your best song. The manner in which her smile lit up the room upon hearing the words almost made it worth it in his mind. Almost. The moment she started singing, he could feel the doubt creep into his skull, although at the very least she was having a fun time. That and when they were done they could just walk out of the door. At the very least, he wasn't alone this time. Looking around the room, he noticed that both Archon and Kat had crossed into Chaldea with him and the others. He privately wondered if that meant they would now be joining the Chaldean roster. If they were, then that was another good thing that had come out of this besides the food and other supplies. He also noticed Ash immediately opened the door the second he got in and walked out of the room. A small part of him envied Ash for a few moments. As he turned back to Elizabeth, the girl still singing her heart out and destroying the word of music itself, he did admit to himself that it was still a fair bit of fun. Even if the ending was rather vocal. This is hardly worth it. Anshin Sama. Kiyohime whispered to him with a strangled tone of voice, can we not just beat her up? Ritska shook his head. She set this all up. We'll at least humor her this once, but I really hope this doesn't become a trend. He paused as he realized his own words before he scrunched up his expression and slapped a hand over his face. I just jinxed it. 105. Trial Quest, Scathach. Trial Quest, Scathach. Ash's eyes darted to his side as he followed the blur closing in on him. He swung his sword upwards as it halted for a split second. His effort was rewarded with a clang as he parried the red spear into the air, the wielder merely smirking at him before leaning his body to the side and swinging a leg out. Ash frowned, raising his free arm in front of him and grimacing as the heel made contact with his guard. The force behind the kick sent him skating backwards along the ground, the mud underneath his feet grinding further downwards as he carved a small valley through the filth. Lowering the sword arm, Ash swiftly pocketed the weapon into his box and rushed forwards. Red eyes briefly widened in surprise at the sudden move before they narrowed. His opponent charged him with speed he could only dream of, closing the distance between the pair of them in a split second. Emerald-colored eyes moved upwards as he watched the crimson lance fall down through the air towards him like a hammer. His expression remained steeled as his next weapon flew from his box and into his hands. The attack was halted when the spear slammed into the cross guard of another lance. The blue-haired man's smirk merely grew when he saw the new weapon his opponent had pulled out. The spear was deftly pulled back and then twirled around his body as nothing more than a spinning blur of red before it abruptly halted and thrust towards him. Ash grasped his spear with both hands, allowing the memories of the previous wielders to flow into him. He thrust upwards at the same time, both spears ground against their opposite as they rushed towards their targets. Ash winced slightly as the crimson spear nicked a shallow cut in his shoulder as it was redirected. His opponent turned their body at the last moment to avoid the cross spear striking them, the cross guard in a vertical direction as it slid just past the right shoulder. Green eyes narrowed slightly before Ash rolled the weapon in his grasp before he pulled back. The cross guard turned horizontal and struck the back of the right pauldron. The spear wielder stumbled forwards as he was jerked in the direction of Ash. The unkindled threw his body forwards, twisting himself and slamming his shoulder into his attacker, and found himself rewarded with a gasp as the blow shunted his attacker away from him. The blue-armored man allowed the momentum of the blow to allow him to roll back before he then fell onto his front, swiftly altering his stance to appear more like a beast and sending a challenging smirk towards the saber. The man rushed forwards, Ash's instinct screamed at him to dodge. He stepped to the side, just narrowly avoiding being run through as the lancer shot past him like a crossbow bolt. Time seemed to slow down as the pair made eye contact with each other before time resumed as Cu blew past him with a rush of wind. Ash turned on his heel and charged after the lancer. Kicking off the ground, he jumped into the air and raised the spear above his head, tightly gripping it with both hands before thrusting it downwards as he approached the ground. Cu span around, looking up and noticing the attack. He jumped back to avoid it as Ash slammed into the dirt, kicking up a small explosion of soil before he rushed out of the cloud before it even had a chance to fall. Cu swung his spear out across him, meeting the thrust head-on and swiping it away from his person. He altered his footing and pulled the length of the spear back up his hand before grasping the butt of the weapon with his free hand and swinging it upwards into the charging attacker. The spear slammed against his attacker's jaw with a thud. They stepped back before Cu rushed forwards, thrusting forwards nearly a dozen times in under a half a dozen seconds. Eyes snapped down to him as the saber worked furiously to block and redirect all of the attacks. The spearwork in his hands was certainly skilled, but it was unpolished. Missing something, as if being repeated is nothing more than a memory. Cu's lip curled in disgust as he found himself being reminded of a certain archer who also used weapons not traditionally belonging to his class. Although at the very least he could say that Ash took his job very seriously, so he had some pride in his work. That was always a plus. Taking the spear into both hands, Cu swung it across himself in a wide arc, forcing Ash to lean backwards to avoid being struck with it. The lancer took advantage of the opening and swung his leg out to the side as he allowed the momentum of the swing to carry him. His boot collided with Ash's ribs and sent the saber sprawling along the ground for a few meters. Cu rushed after him in a blur, thrusting down towards him as he rolled back up to his feet. He noticed a split second before he made contact with the saber that the weapon in his hands had changed again. As he thrust towards him, he found his attack being redirected upwards by a short dark spear in the Ash's left hand. Then he had to lean back to avoid a longer spear, the same length as his own, from running through his face. He watched as the spear passed just in front of his eyes before he kicked off the ground and flipped away, making sure to catch the spear with his feet as he did so and force Ash to stagger away to assume his own stance once again. "What is it with me and dual wielders?" Cu asked as he landed on his feet, scoffing to himself as he rested the spear on his right shoulder and staring at the saber with a slasher grin. "Two spears as well. May as well call yourself a lancer. It would be strange, I am more used to wielding swords." Ash admitted without much hesitation as he returned to his feet, holding both weapons out in front of him, the short spear held in the middle of its grip and turned sideways to him while the long spear was cocked back in preparation to thrust. "Although I have wielded spears on occasion. I can tell." Cu snorted as he shook his head. "Ain't got a single style of your own, do you?" Ash raised an eyebrow at him. "You noticed? Meh, they're all incomplete." Cu waved his hand dismissively, lacking a certain polish to them. "You ain't bad, but you ain't great either. Sort of average." He paused, then shook his head. "Although at least you won all those weapons in combat, right?" Ash nodded his head. "The more powerful ones I earned through battle, yes." "Back to it then." Cu snorted and charged forwards. "That old hag would have my head if she found out I lost to an undead while wielding this spear." He chuckled as he collided with Ash, locking Guy Bolg against the two spears caught in a cross guard and forcing the saber backwards. Ash narrowed his eyes as his feet dug into the ground, eventually sliding to a halt. "Your teacher who slew undead, yes. A couple gods too." Cu turned to the side as Ash pulled back the short spear and thrust towards his body, the spear sailing past him before he pushed the long spear back and twirled the weapon in his grasp again. Ash stepped back and raised the short spear in a guard as he advanced on him, his spear crashing against the weapon repeatedly in a shower of sparks. "She might like you." Cu paused before he broke through the guard and kicked Ash in the chest, sending him flying head over heels and rolling across the ground. "Actually, she might also hate you too. Depends on which comes first." Ash stabbed the short spear into the ground, slowing himself to a halt and snapping his head up before he narrowed his eyes. Kicking off the ground, he charged towards the lancer. The man shifted his stance in preparation for Ash to close the distance between the two of them. The long spear came down first, striking at his side. Cu turned the spear over his side, halting the strike and leaning back. The short spear was swung up at his neck, prompting the lancer to raise his forearm, blocking the attack and locking the offending limb in his own. The pair stared at each other before Cu raised his spear up, flipping the other long spear over the top of his head and spinning Ash in the direction of the weapon. Ash reversed the grip on the short spear as he turned, spinning on his heel and thrusting it towards the lancer's ribs. Cu jumped back as the spear sailed towards him, sliding the length of his spear back up his hand and swinging out at Ash as he did so. The pair winced as Ash managed to score a shallow cut along Cu's side with the short spear as he turned back around. He similarly winced as Cu managed to cut along the top of his head with the crimson spear. The pair threw themselves away from the other to gain distance. Cu stared at him for a few moments before his eyes trailed down to the small cut in his bodysuit, giving it a raised eyebrow before raising his head and looking at Ash. The saber had a cut just above his right eye, already starting to leak dark liquid down his face. Cu hummed as he idly twirled the spear in his hands, watching as the saber followed his movements with a critical eye before he paused, halting the turning of the spear and sweeping it out in front of him. Ash hurled the short spear towards him. The lancer effortlessly deflected the flying spear with a hint of amusement in his eyes as Ash rushed in. Then found himself blinking in surprise as the saber, instead of going for a normal thrust, instead stabbed his long spear into the ground as he ran and used it as a jumping point, pole vaulting himself into the air and spinning around before swinging the spear down towards him. The lancer was left dumbfounded by the blatant theft of his moves before he thinned his lips and raised his own spear sideways and caught the attack against the pole of his weapon. The pair struggled against each other for a few moments before Cu roughly pushed the saber back through the air, then kicked off the ground after him. Appearing in the air above the saber, he shot straight down and collided with the servant's guard and sent them both rocketing into the dirt. Soil exploded again when the pair went flying out of the cloud, Ash stepping backwards with Cu chasing him down like a wolf. Ash grit his teeth as the lancer's attacks fell on him in a furious barrage, so he did the only thing he could think of. He set his spear on fire. The sudden burst of heat exploding out from the spear caused Cu to briefly halt his attack and wince as the two weapons clashed against each other again. Sparks of embers flying from the weapon and washing over the two of them. Ash's left hand exploded in a ball of flame, consuming the pair of them. Ash knew for a fact his pyromancy wasn't strong enough to get past Lancer's magic resistance. However, that didn't mean that the explosion didn't serve a purpose. The bright flash of light temporarily blinded the Lancer and caused him to swing out through the cloud on reflex. Ash caught the spear with his left forearm, wincing as the bladed edge of the weapon dug through his gauntlet with a screech before it halted. Ash's right hand thrust his spear forwards through the cloud. He felt the weapon violently jerk upwards as the smoke cleared, revealing that Cu had parried the blow away with a backhand of his own aimed skywards. Cu smirked at him before swinging his leg towards Ash. The saber met the kick with one of his own. The two legs bashed against each other like hammers, producing a small shockwave as the force behind them blasted the other away. As Ash rolled away, he raised his left hand and slammed the burning palm into his own chest. Wisps of flame washed over his body, clinging to him in burning orange lines before he hunched his body, already feeling the spell boost his strength. At the same time, the pressure around the Irish Lancer exploded. The air visibly shifted as his body moved. Ash swung to the side as he came flying at him from the right. The two clashed as Lancer flew past him. The blow sent him staggering back and already turning to the left as the next attack flew in. He managed to keep his feet on the ground when the Lancer collided with him again, gritting his teeth as he found himself skating along the ground by the force of the attack. Red eyes met green as they shoved against each other. Ash purposefully fell backwards, kicking upwards and throwing the Irish Lancer over the top of him. Cu crashed into the dirt in a roll before carrying himself back into his feet and turning around, this time finding himself on the defensive from Ash, who charged him down with the burning spear still in hand. There was hardly a comparison between the two of them. Cu had strength, speed and technique. Ash had brute force and an inkling of skill with a weapon, but nothing masterful. However, as he swung the spear around, Cu narrowed his eyes the longer they fought. Noticing that bit by bit he could see parts of his own style being reflected in the saber's attacks, being mixed with whoever had wielded the spear before him. His moves becoming fiercer and more coordinated. That being said, it was still a clumsy mimicry, nothing more than surface level, akin to a child repeating an action he had been shown. His eyes narrowed slightly at the movements. Watching the technique of himself and his teacher get used so clumsily was a bit irritating. He blocked the next strike by the burning spear. The moment Ash pulled it back to resume his attack, Cu launched forwards, thrusting his spear down and through the saber's thigh. The spear burst through his limb and nailed him to the ground. He swung upwards, catching the saber with an uppercut and causing his body to fall backwards. As Ash fell, he let go of his spear, the weapon clattering to the ground. Cu made to advance before he noticed the eyes snapped down towards him and narrowed. His instincts warned him immediately. His hand grasped the spear in Ash's leg and ripped it out with a spurt of blood. Ash swung his body back upwards, sweeping Galvatine through the air and unleashing a wave of demonic fire from the blade. Cu lowered his body to the ground as the heat rushed over him before he rolled to the side as the blade struck the dirt. Chaos flames washed across the surface as Ash yanked the sword back and sent a spray of burning soil towards the lancer. Cu rolled back onto his feet and swung his lance through the air, the force behind the sweep bringing with it a gust of wind which sent the shrapnel flying away from him. Ash hobbled slightly on his wounded leg, the greatsword in his hand still burning bright with vicious orange flames which flickered erratically. The two charged at each other again. Ash lay on the ground, staring up with a flat expression before he pulled himself up and stared at the lancer with a raised eyebrow. That seemed more violent than usual. Cu sniffed. Sort of pissed me off there. He wasn't too far from the saber, propped up against the burning remains of a simulated tree as the area around them had been scorched. Ash's rather cavalier use of flames had done most of the damage, swapping out skill for keeping him distracted and not giving him a chance to use his speed. He certainly used a lot of tricks. Namely, you stealing my moves and making them shit. Ash tilted his head slightly before he understood, nodding slowly. Your spear moves, yes, I did attempt to copy them as well. You ain't built for that and you remind me of that red archer bastard. Really? Ash furrowed his brows slightly, pursing his lips and looking away as he climbed back onto his feet, making sure not to put pressure on the leg that had been skewered. He seems to hold some resentment towards me. Good to know, then you can't be all that bad. Cu snorted, grunting as he used his own spear to hoist himself back up before dissipating it and crossing his arms. You've never been taught by anyone, have you? Just learned by watching or fighting? I can tell. Ash nodded once. Fair enough. Cu shrugged, rubbing his forehead. Can't fault that, still though. The man sighed. But yeah, if my teacher caught you swinging your spear like that, she'd probably break every bone in your body. She's very proud of her skill. The old hag, yes? I'm really hoping she never finds out I called her that. Cu whispered to himself with a grimace, shivering slightly and looking around suspiciously. I have a feeling it wouldn't be all that pleasant for me. Sniffing once, he shook his head and clapped his hand. Anyway, not bad I guess. He shrugged at the saber, still one though. So it seems. Ash replied without much of a care before leaning down and picking up the long spear from off the ground and resting it on his shoulders. Your magic resistance is troublesome. Most opponents I fought did not have that. From what you're telling me, most guys you fought were also batshit crazy. The exception of Prince Lorien, however, he was crippled. How bad did he kick your ass? I died frequently to him, yes. Ash nodded his head once. He had no use for his legs and, like me, could be revived. A man who couldn't use his legs killed you? Cu raised an eyebrow at him, creasing his brows. What the fuck could he have done if he had legs then? Ash scratched the back of his neck. I am certain it would have taken longer to defeat him if he were capable of walking. Well, at least you're honest about it. Cu shrugged. His expression then shifted into a more cheerful one. And still willing to say you'd win. Good on you. Ash, can you come to the command room please? The intercom chimed above the pair's heads. Both looked upwards as Romani's voice rang out again. I repeat. Ash, can you come to the command room? Thank you. Huh. CU blinked before he gave a frown. I bet this is going to be something good. I'm probably going to miss out on it too. Clicking his tongue, he crossed his arms and shook his head. Bah. I'll have to get Master to make it up to me somehow. Ash raised an eyebrow at him in a questioning fashion before he shrugged his shoulders and turned away from the Lancer, limping away and towards the door as the simulation shut down, the room reverting to its usual blank self and the burned remains of trees and charred patches of grass vanishing into nothing. The door to the command room hissed open as Ash stepped inside. Ritska, Mash, Romani and Olga were already present in the room huddled around a screen. Hey Ash, thanks for coming, what the heck? Ritska welcomed, turning around to face the saber only to balk at the state of him. Cuts across his face and a large puncture wound in his leg. What did? He paused, a resigned look flashing across his face. You were sparring with CU again, weren't you? Yes. Ash nodded in response, noticing how everyone else merely stared at him with exhausted features. Except Romani, who looked somewhat panicked by his appearance. He is one of the few servants who does not attempt to hold back against me. Because Celts are bloodthirsty. Olga bluntly commented as she looked over her shoulder at him with a noticeable frown. Much as I might commend you for keeping yourself in a state of readiness, it shouldn't come at the expense of your own well-being. Especially if you're going to show up looking like that. Are you alright, Ash-san? Mash asked, the only one to do so thus far. Giving his wounds a rather concerned glance. Is it bad? I have had worse. Ash replied with a stone-faced expression as he walked closer, the shielder's eyes noticeably drifting to his wounded leg where her concerned look seemed to intensify slightly. A healing spell will abate the damage in short order. He assured her with a curt nod before turning to the others. Was there something you needed? Romani stared at him for a few moments before turning around and pointing to the screen. It's Singularity F, the one you were first summoned into. Ash raised an eyebrow at him. Is there something wrong with it? That's what we're trying to figure out. Romani replied with a thoughtful frown. Most other singularities we solved disappeared after we finished. Sure, we get a few minuscule events happening in or around the time, but nothing so damaging as the singularity itself. He turned around and cupped his chin. Singularity F, however, the singularity in Fuyuki remains ongoing. Olga carried on, biting her thumb as she glared at the screen. Disturbances are still ongoing in this singularity, and even with the Holy Grail no longer present, it shows no signs of stopping. For the time being, this singularity does not seem to be able to disappear. The woman paused before removing her thumb from between her teeth and giving a thinking pose, perhaps because it was unrelated to the Holy Grail, or perhaps the Holy Grail made the problem worse. Ritska blinked before he looked back at the screen. So the original problem is still there, but the Grail just made it bigger. In layman's terms, yes. Olga nodded her head. However, as it stands, this singularity is low on the list of dangers. It is limited to a single city in 2004 and does not seem to do any damage on the whole of human history. She paused before turning around to face the group. That said, I am allowing the formation of teams to try and understand the root cause of the singularity and deal with it. As this is the initial scouting mission, I'm sending in the servants who were originally present. She looked around. Namely you three. Ash nodded his head but said nothing more as the director turned to Ritska and pointed at him. You're going to simply take a quick scout of the city while we analyze the readings. They seem to have spiked in the last 12 hours, but since then they've stabilized. Find out what caused the spike. Yes, director. Ritska and Mash nodded their heads before moving towards the door. Ash remained behind for a moment longer as he stared down at the director with an indiscernible expression. The woman stared up at him for a few seconds before she frowned. What? What are you looking at? You seem more comfortable than you did before. Ash bluntly commented, his lip twitching slightly. Which is good. Olga stared at him in silence before she waved in the direction of the door. Just go and follow them. Get yourself cleaned up too. You're hardly going to be any help if you can't walk straight. She received a curt nod of the head from the saber before he turned away and limped back towards the direction of the door. She crossed her arms and watched him depart with a scowl before shaking her head and turning back around, seeing Romani glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. What now? He's right, you know. Romani replied with a gentle tone as he went back to the monitor, you seem to be a bit more comfortable than you did before. She scoffed at him, be quiet. Romani sighed, yes, director. Leaning over the desk, he called out to the operator below him, Munier, prepare the chamber for departure. He looked to another, Maxwell, look for a suitable landing spot, Carrie. Prepare some banging tunes. The woman asked with a smirk. It faltered slightly when Romani sent her a flat look and the director's eyes narrowed. Coughing into her hand, the woman turned back to her own screen. I'll monitor any fluctuations in the singularity. Good. Olga grunted and stared down at the rayshift chamber through the window. Perhaps we might be able to finally manage a single smooth operation. Well, not if you say that we won't. Carrie muttered under her breath. There were few moments in his life where Ash would find himself resigned to something. Yet this was one of those times. The rayshift had seemingly gone according to plan up until the point they arrived in the era. And he suddenly found himself hurtling towards the ground from high enough that he couldn't make out any individual structures. The entire city looked like a sea of flames and blocks of rock from where he had arrived. His eyes scanned left and right as he fell through the sky, not seeing any sign of either Mash nor of Ritska, which was some small comfort that they were not also about to become as intimate with the ground as he was. He turned his head back towards the ground and watched himself race towards it. Frowning, he then raised his left hand and pointed downwards. Either releasing a jet of fire from his palm would slow his descent ever so slightly, or it would send him into a mad spiral where he would then crash into the ground. Then again, he didn't have much in the way of a choice with his current predicament. Not doing anything was bound to kill him just as likely as doing something and it going wrong. His mind made up, he thrust his hand downwards and channeled as much magical energy as he physically could into his pyromancy flame. The hand flickered with the orange light for a few moments before it positively exploded, his body jerking at the sudden momentum pushing against him as he fell. Ash grit his teeth and moved his right arm to support his left to try and keep it steady as he fell. The flames continued to jet out from his hand. He could feel himself slowing down, bit by bit, although it was more a case of instead of dying on impact he was more liable to break his legs this time. He paused when he recalled what Mash had done in this previous situation, using her shield to absorb the impact. He didn't have many shields that were quite as large as hers, however, and the only one he could think of was rather cumbersome. Cutting off the flame, he felt himself begin to speed up as he reached into his body and flipped the lid open, his hands grasping at the handles before swinging out the paired great shields. The twin doors reinforced with metal slammed together in front of him. Shutting closed as he grit his feet and felt the noble phantasm activate. The shield was good for protecting him. It wasn't good for protecting anyone else. His eyes tightly shut themselves as he felt his body crash into something. Whatever he struck gave way and he felt himself fall again, debris falling down around him as he felt his body violently jerk around and his arms scream in protest as impact after impact assailed his body. He was jerked to the side rather roughly as something crashed into his back, likely a piece of falling debris, and he was sent rolling away and crashing through another stone construct. He felt his body go weightless and briefly caught himself staring up at the pitch-black sky and before his eyes locked onto the remains of the tower block he had struck. The ruins, which had already been crumbling from the flames, had given way to his body and now brought the entire building crumbling down before him, vanishing into a cloud of dust as he rolled through the air before crashing into the street. Metal groaned and screamed behind him as he landed on the ruins of a burnt-out car and bent its body to suit him. He lay there for a few moments before letting out a long groan, parting the closed shields in front of him and undoing their protection from his body. Staring up at the sky, he could hear only the crackle of flames intermittent with the crashing sound of the apartment building collapsing into dust. Eventually, he managed to will his body to straighten up. The car beneath him groaned in protest as he crumpled the doors and roof every time he shifted his body before he jumped onto his feet. Turning his head left and right, he frowned at the complete lack of any sort of company he found himself with. He allowed the shields to return to their previous form, their bodies flowing back into the bottomless box and galvatine flowing out to replace them. The greatsword comfortably fitted inside his grasp as he raised it up and rested it upon his right shoulder. Now he just had to find Ritska and Mash. Utterly unaware of the pair of red eyes watching him intently, having seen his fall and subsequent landing. Not to mention having seen through his undead nature. The eyes narrowed as their owner rose up from a crouch. The crimson spear in their hand flashed with energy before they kicked off the ground and into the air, leaping from the building they had been perched upon and moving through the sky like a blur as they closed in on their prey. Ritska snapped his head as the echoing crash echoed out just above the roar of flames. The master narrowed his eyes and furrowed his brows as he listened out for any other sounds. Did you hear that? He asked Mash. The shielder girl to his left paused for a moment before she slowly nodded her head. You mean the crash, senpai? At his nod, she gave an affirmation. I did. Do you think Ash makes up for in destruction what he lacks in subtlety? Ritska sagely replied to her as he scanned his surroundings. Anything from Chaldea yet? No, senpai. Mash shook her head with a troubled frown. Still haven't been able to establish contact with Chaldea. Which means that neither Dr. Roman nor the director will be able to speak with us, nor will they get readings from our position. She paused, looking around and frowning intently. It might have something to do with our situation. You can feel that as well. You can, senpai. Mash asked in surprise before quickly schooling her features, the weird feeling that something is wrong here. Yeah, Ritska nodded his head with a grim expression. It feels different to the last time we were here. The director said something about these flames being cursed, but it feels like it's way more than that. He rubbed his forehead in exasperation as he failed to find the right words. It sort of reminds me of that Halloween forest. With the spirits? Mash inquired. At his nod she gave a more troubled frown. That was 2 days ago. Do you think it has anything to do with that actual Samhain event? You meet the spirit world crossing over into the normal world? He asked, turning to her and then blanching. I hope not. That would be terrifying. With magic and that being real, Halloween sounds like a horror story waiting to happen. He paused, but if it were the case, wouldn't it make more sense for that to occur on the actual Halloween? The Fuyuki singularity is strange. Mash shrugged her shoulders and pursed her lips. The influx of curses and the destabilization of normal history, combined with the Grail that had been here, might mean that the boundary between worlds is naturally weak. She paused. This was where the first servants from Ash Sand's world were summoned. Ritska scratched his chin in thought. So, expect Singularity F to be a hotspot for all sorts of weird goings-on for the time being and see. He paused. You don't suppose that all the Samhain is the reason that the readings spiked, do you? He turned to her and raised an eyebrow. Mash blinked at him in surprise before she furrowed her brows. An increase in the number of spirits here would be consistent with a jump in reading intensity. She muttered with a thoughtful expression before looking back up at him. That might be it, senpai. She paused again. But we would have to get back to Chaldea and get readings to find out. And we're cut off from Chaldea. A beat, again. Sighing to himself, he reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose. Why does this sort of thing always happen? He lamented with a shake of the head. Oh, we're just going on a scouting mission. Perfectly routine. Next thing you know I'm face down in the street and Ash is nowhere to be seen and probably already getting into trouble. Stepping down the rubble, he frowned to himself. Honestly, sometimes it's weird to think that Ash is younger than me and then other times he does real childish stuff. Mash blinked at him. Is it? She asked, tilting her head and following after him. I'm younger than you though, senpai. Yeah, but you aren't 6 foot. Ritska replied back with a chuckle. Nor do you look a bit older than me. He paused at the base of the rubble, then turned around to face Mash as she was still stepping down. Can you just stay still a second? He asked. Senpai. Mash furrowed her brows in confusion but acquiesced to the suggestion and paused, staring down at Ritska as he stepped closer to her and looked up. Mash felt herself heat up ever so slightly as she looked at him while he stared up with a certain intensity. Is something wrong, senpai? Blinking, he shook his head and stepped away from her. No. I was just wondering how it would feel to have you look down on me, he explained as he placed his hands on his hips and thinned his lips, giving her a blank expression. I think I've found out something about myself though, he quietly muttered to himself before turning around. Come on then, we've got a saber to find, then we can work out if the ghosts are invading or not. I don't think ghosts can invade, senpai. Mash called out as she chased after him. They can get drawn to places of strong. She paused before an expression of understanding hit her. Ah. That was a joke, wasn't it, senpai? Yep, senpai. Yes, Mash. Why don't you call Ash-san with the servant link? I forgot I could do that. Ritsuka replied after a moment of silence, slapping himself on the forehead and flashing the shielder a smile. Thanks. Ash. He paused as Ritsuka's voice reverberated through his head. The saber looked up. Yes, Ritsuka. You are safe. Me and Mash are fine. Ritsuka replied back through the link. What about you? We heard a crash a few moments ago and you weren't with us when we came down. You also fell. What do you mean, also? Ash blinked once before he spoke back through the link. You said you also came down, did you not? He asked through the link. I manifested in the air once again and fell through some sort of tower. Were you not also teleported into the air? There was silence from the other end before Ritsuka replied to him. No, we ray-shifted at ground level. Did you seriously? What the heck is wrong with this equipment? The master asked rhetorically through the link in an irritated tone. Most advanced piece of engineering on the planet and they keep managing to mess up basic altitude. While Chaldea and ray-shifting is very advanced, senpai. Mash's voice filtered through the link. Dr. Roman said that items crafted by Atlas are much more advanced. Atla, what, the Titan? Huh. Oh no. The Institute. Atlas Institute. It's one of the 3 major branches in the Mages Association. You have the Clock Tower, Atlas and the Wandering Sea. That last one sounds like a pretty badass title. Ritsuka admitted. Wandering Sea, anyway, so these guys make more advanced stuff. Apparently. Although information regarding them is very difficult to come by, especially for the Wandering Sea. Shame. Ritsuka replied with a tone of audible disappointment. Where was I? Ah, right. Me and Mash landed safely and we heard the explosion, so we're going to make our way in that general direction. Can you shoot off a signal or something? Ash remained silent before he looked at his sword. I can fire a beam of light into the sky. Look for the white light and I will remain put here. He raised his sword and pointed it upwards. The platinum blade danced with power as the center of it began to lighten up and rushed towards the tip of the sword. A few seconds later, the light rushed away from the blade and shot upwards into the sky. Aha! We see it now. Ritsuka called through the link a moment later as the light started to vanish away. We're on our way now. Oh, watch out for skeletons or ghosts or something. We think the readings might be because of the spirits or something. Ash frowned. The boundary between worlds breaking down. I am familiar with the process. Really? You are, Ash-san? Mash asked in surprise through the link. I am. It is what allowed the fluid motion between time and worlds via summoning. The boundaries which separated the mirror worlds start to weaken when the flame dies down, making it possible to cross over with ease, whereas before it was only accomplished with great difficulty. He paused. Or so I was told. Sounds lovely. Ritsuka spoke through the link. It was not. Ash replied, completely missing the sarcasm in the voice. He continued to look around. I will stay vigilant until you arrive. I trust in Mash to keep you. He cut himself off and snapped his head to the side as clang echoed out through the street. Ash narrowed his eyes as he watched rubble fall down from one of the high-rise buildings. His eyes snapped up just in time to see the dust blow in a direction as if something had moved through it. Ash. What's wrong? I believe there may be someone here. Ash replied as he lowered his sword back to his side and grabbed the handle with his other hand, tensing his body and looking around for any sign of movement. However, I cannot see them. Hang on, we're on our way. We'll be with you as fast as we can, but let us know if the situation changes. I'll call you back with a command seal if I have to. Ash continued to scan the surrounding buildings with a frown as he turned in a circle, occasionally looking over his shoulder as if hearing some phantom sound in the wind. You should save those for an emergency. Ash replied through the link. tightening his grip on his sword and steadying his breathing, channeling his mana through the weapon, the sword burst into flames. I should be sufficient to last long enough. As I have yet to sense them, I can assume they are an assassin of sorts. You think. I assume. Ash corrected, then paused at another cracking sound before he darted his eyes in that direction and once again saw dust become displaced as if something moved through it. However, I might be mistaken. Watch out either way. If recent events have taught us anything, it's that you shouldn't underestimate a servant based on their mash behind. Ritska's voice echoed through the link before it was abruptly cut off. Ash widened his eyes and tensed his body. Ritska, Ritska, he called out through the link before gritting his teeth and focusing his mind on the link. His head snapped in the vague direction he had sensed his master. If he ran, he would probably catch sight of them. Turning in the direction of the link, he took a single step forwards. I'm going to die. The single thought instantly ran through his mind. That single instinct drove him to spin on his heel and swing his sword upwards, making sure to slash the tip of the weapon against the ground as he did so. The fire on the blade lashed out and washed across the surface of the street, producing a small wave of flames which burnt away everything in front of them. Except the one thing they had been aiming for. Ash widened his eyes, already bringing the flat of his sword back down to act as a shield as something burst through the tsunami of flames and rushed towards him. He could barely make out a flash of crimson and a color of purple before something struck his hastily made guard and he found himself hurtling through the air. His eyes danced around as he tried to figure out which way was up or down. Then the flash of crimson returned and he felt something slam into the side of his ribs before he was redirected away from the direction he had been flying and sent rocketing through the air for a few moments before his back collided with something. Bricks shattered and wood splintered as he was thrown through the entrance of a ruined shop and crashed through the shelves, scattering what few remnants of goods they had left on them across the floor. Ash blinked furiously as he tried to reorientate himself from his dazed state. His eyes drifted to the hole in the wall where he had made his entrance. He briefly caught sight of a shadow moving through the air towards him before he threw his body to the side. Not a moment later the shadow smashed into the spot where he had been sitting and released a burst of crimson light which caused his roll to turn into another short flight before he landed roughly on his back. Already scrambling to get on his feet before the cloud of dust swung out at him, he managed to raise his sword and block the strike, but the force behind it caused him to skate backwards along the tiles. Ceramic crunched under his feet as he slowed himself to a halt and lowered his greatsword, eyes fixated in the smoke as a familiar crimson spear protruded from it. He furrowed his brows as he stared at it before looking back to the dust as it started to settle down. You are not CU. He bluntly stated as the figure became fully visible, a woman wearing a skin-tight purple bodysuit with dark highlights, silver armor plates rested upon her shoulders and a transparent veil rested over the top of her head. Long plum-colored hair freely flowed down her back into her hips, ruby-red eyes flashed in recognition at the name before they narrowed and the woman's lips drew themselves into an intrigued curl. Ho! Her voice was tinged with interest as she twirled the red lance in her hands and rested the tip against the floor. She took slow steady steps as the spear grated along the ground, leaving a thin cut through the floor as she advanced. Ash's eyes danced between the spear and the woman as he tensed himself. Every single one of the instincts he had honed over his journey was telling him that the best thing he could do was to run and hope that he was faster than her. Their encounter just now showed that it was nothing but a fantasy. He was going to have to fight her. So you know Satanta, do you? She continued on with a tilt of the head. I wonder, I don't recognize you, but I know you're kind. Her eyes narrowed and Ash felt his undead heart stop at the pressure she suddenly exuded. So what are you doing free of the land of shadows? Raising her spear, she pointed it towards him. Are you another remnant unable to die or, perhaps something different? She lowered the spear again. Ash narrowed his eyes. The woman's way of speaking in regards to Cu Chulain and her spear left him with one guess. Are you his teacher? The woman stared at him, something passing through her eyes. And if I were? Ash stared blankly at her. You don't look like an old hag. Ah, so you wish to die then? The woman merely commented as though she was talking about the weather before she vanished in a blur of movement. Ash widened his eyes as she reappeared in front of him, swinging the spear through the air and cutting through the wall to his left as though it didn't even exist for her. He swung his sword to the side to block the strike. Then she leaned back and kicked up. Her armored boot crashed against his chin, with the result being that he was sent punching through the floor above, the purple-haired woman chasing after him a split second later. Ha! Mash let out a cry as she parried away the scythe moving through the air towards her. The red spirit stumbled back from the movement as the shielder charged in. Mash ducked down as the scythe flipped and came back through the air. The weapon passed just above her head before she moved into the guard of the attacker. The red spirit turned its hood to stare down at her before the glowing orbs behind its veil widened as she struck upwards against its chest. The spirit released a howl as they were sent rocketing away from the girl. Mash turned and raised her shield as a sword clanged against its surface. The girl twisted the shield and pushed the sword to the side, flipping the shield and swinging the butt of it downwards into the top of the wraith's head. A growl responded to her as she ducked back around and swung her leg around, striking the wraith in the ankles and sweeping its feet out from underneath it. The wraith fell sideways as Mash swung back around and thrust her shield upwards into their side. The wraith released a cry of pain as they were thrown through the air. Mash looked left and right as she saw more of the red spirits start to appear, as if phasing into the world and all brandishing some manner of weapon as they approached. A ring of light flew through the air, striking one of the wraiths in the side and burning through their body. The spirit released a cry of pain before it vanished into dust. The others seemingly paused and snapped their heads towards the direction the attack had come from. Mash and Ritska similarly followed them as a figure came charging through the flames towards the wraiths. Dirty steel armor with a ragged red cloak covering their head and shoulders being the only distinguishing features about them, the man jumped into the thick of the fighting. Rolling under a swipe from a great sword before unsheathing his own weapon and swinging back, cleaving through the arm with ease before spinning on their heel and cutting the body in half. The man turned back around as the wraiths rushed in. Raising the flat of his greatsword, he blocked the first strike and countered with an elbow to the face and a kick to the knee which sent them to the ground. As the next attacker ran in, he swung back and smashed the pommel of the greatsword into the side of their head, following the attack by cutting their head off. He turned back to the downed wraith as they attempted to get up, raising his greatsword above his head and bringing it down in a single strike. He turned to the final wraith and charged towards them, bringing his greatsword back up and meeting their first blow head-on. He then pushed past their guard and unleashed a series of simple swings towards them. Mash watched with intrigued eyes as the servant attacked the wraith. There wasn't any wasted effort in the moves and they weren't particularly flashy either. Despite that, the red-cloaked servant showed a deadly amount of skill as they knocked the greatsword out of the hands of the spirit and then swung down through their collarbone and dissipated them into nothing. Content that the danger had passed, the red-cloaked servant straightened themselves out with a grumble before turning in the direction of Mash and Ritska. It was only when they turned to face them that the pair found the servant's person familiar, recalling having met them before. The ragged red cloak which covered their shoulders and the hood hiding away their face, the long gray beard spilling down from their chin, to the dirty steel armor and old-looking sword. Mash's eyes widened before she assumed a defensive position in front of Ritska and narrowed her eyes at the servant. Although the servant looked very, very different to the last time she remembered seeing them. Their body was no longer absurdly giant, now standing perhaps a little taller than Ash and thoroughly lacking in the same presence. In fact, there was hardly a comparison to be made between the two of them. The berserker they fought was physically imposing and brutally destructive in their attacks. This was an old man in armor, and yet servants were supposed to be summoned in the prime of their skill in accordance with the class. The old servant stared at them before raising up their greatsword. Mash already tensed herself for combat, watching as the sword was raised up. Then blinked as the old man slowly sheathed it back into the scabbard on his back. A poor place for young ones to be. The old voice called out to them, sounding grizzled yet holding a very gentle tone to it. What brings you here amongst the dark wraiths and remnants of the undead? Wait a second, Ritska peeked out from behind Mash. I know you're. He snapped his fingers repeatedly as he tried to remember the name before it clicked and he pointed at the man. You're Gale, right? The old man straightened out in surprise. Oh. You know of me, and we have met before. The man paused for a moment, His right gauntlet rose up and scratched his beard in a thoughtful manner. I recall no such instance of meeting either of you, perhaps after I had died, yes. He asked himself before he looked around. This is a poor place for conversation. Come, children, we should make haste from here. We can't. Mash blurted out before she could help it, watching as the old man paused and turned to her in a questioning manner. We need to find another servant who came with us. Gale stared at her for a few moments in silence before he looked to Ritska. The master gave a single nod of the head in response. Gale hummed before a grim chuckle emerged from the hood. Then let us depart for your missing friend. He turned around and started to wander down the streets. I know the burden of being left alone. Let us see your comrade return to you. Ritska and Mash looked at each other before nodding their heads and following after him, easily catching up to him and directing his attention to the location Ash had pointed them in. Trial quest time, and it is a little different from canon, but that's fine with me. Also, genuine Gale. Scathach gets to meet one of the few humans who can call her young lady and mean it. Anyway, stats. Slave Knight Gale. Servant, Saber. Strength, C. Endurance, C. Agility, C. Mana, C. Luck, C. Noble Phantasm, C. Wisdom of the Old Warrior. I see avenues of combat, C. Anti-unit max target, 1, max range, 0. It is not an offensive skill but can be used as such. The ultimate in his personal skill and above the likes of Mind's Eye. When activated, the Noble Phantasm allows him to instantly determine the best course of action needed to win an engagement or how best to flee. It is not like Mind's Eye where the conclusion is built, it is an instantaneous response. As expected of one who survived until the end of the world to be aware of how to best achieve victory or avoid dying. Class skills. Riding, C. Magic resistance, A. Dregs of the Dark Soul, E. Even though the blood no longer dwells within him, the remnants of its pigment remain attached to his soul. It recognizes its former carrier, but he cannot wield it in an offensive manner. However, it has raised his magic resistance to a rank. Personal skills. Miracles, B. Slave Knight, X. A combination of eternal arms mastery and battle continuation. He is a slave knight who lasted until the end of the world, the will to hold off hollowing until the very end. He can suffer no end of horrific injuries that would kill a lesser spirit while his mind retains fortitude to fight even under mental interference. Mystic Slayer, A+. Long life of many wars. He has slain many beings, which has earned him this skill at this high level. Mind's Eye, True, A++. Quickly able to discern the correct course of action to either fight or flee. Reading through the patterns of an opponent becomes simple and weaknesses become visible. Valor, A++. Summoning, I am the servant, Saber. Gale, I have come to act as your soldier. Dialogue 1. You may remain idle as long as you wish, Master. It is not my place to act. Dialogue 2. Master and Servant. Ha, 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 it has been many years since I heard such titles, although back then it was Master and Slave. Dialogue 3. I may be old, but I'm certainly more experienced than a great deal of other servants here. Do not worry yourself, little harm shall come to you while I live. Dialogue 4. If you have Knights of the Round Table. Knights you say, and they are true ones too. Not like me, perhaps they would see it as an insult to bear the same title as them, although, they seem good enough folk. Dialogue 5. If you have Ashen one. I owe him a debt I may never repay, he did as I asked and more. Perhaps a story for another time. Dialogue 6. If you have Artoria. After completing Camelot. She came to me recently, you know. She said that she disliked the way I was referred to as a slave knight, and said it should only be a title given to those who are honorable. She said she would only refer to me as a proper knight should, and declared me Sir Gale. It was an unnecessary kindness, but appreciated. Dialogue 7. If you have Bedivere. To wander the sands of the time for so long for a purpose you believe in, you did a grand job, Knight Bedivere. A grand job indeed. It was my deepest honor to aid you in this task. Dialogue 8. If you have Ornstein. It is no surprise to see my former master here, he was straightforward with his tactics. Or rather, by the book's commander as you would say. I lost many friends under him. Dialogue 9. If you have divine spirits. I never encountered a true god before. Now they are everywhere, however these ones are different to those who resided in Orlando. They are far more involved in the affairs of humans. Whether or not that is a welcome change, is yet to be decided. Dialogue 10. If you have Santa lilies. They keep calling me Santa Claus. I do not know who that is. They also seem to expect presents every time they see me. I give them wood carvings. They are often disappointed unless I give them what they want. Dialogue 11. If you have Mordred. She is rather willful, but there is talent there. It's buried deep. I find her company to be a welcome change to the others, however I do wish she would stop calling me Gramps. Dialogue 12. If you have Gwyndolin. There is nothing to be said. He will never acknowledge my existence because his father never did. Whether or not that is fine with me is irrelevant, I am used to it. Dialogue 13. If you have Nursery Rhyme. She's a rather soft-spoken young girl. She reminds me so much of dear little Arya. She's even taken to calling me Uncle Gale. She's a fragile little thing. Dialogue 14. If you have Jack the Ripper. An unfortunate soul, perhaps a culmination of the unfairness of the young, it matters not to me. I shall care for her, she deserves that much at least. Dialogue 15. If you have Kiera Sessioin. Refrain thyself from my presence, harlot. Go bewitch some other poor soul, leave our master be. Dialogue 16. If you have Senji Muramasa. I suppose we're both old men. Yes, the young are far too eager to run head first into trouble, although I'm rather jealous of you. Why? Look at you. I at least look my age. Dialogue 17. If you have Yume Ren. One who understands the burden of a long life. Perhaps she may yet forget things, but I was not afforded such luxury. However, I understand the pain of time more deeply than even you. I pray you find an end before you reach half my age. If not, then you have my sympathies, child. Dialogue 18. If you have Scathach. I am so very, very sorry. The burden of age is a curse on all. That you will never find freedom from it is a fate even worse than death, some might say. That dream you hold of freedom from this life, I hope you might realize it. At the very least, I might offer you the knowledge that you are still younger than I. Likes. I don't particularly have any. Hates. Things I hate. I gave up on hating long ago. I simply never ran out of things to despise, so simply ignore them. Wish for the Holy Grail. Wishes. No, it's not important. Bond level 1. You're doing well, however there is still much room to improve upon. Blonde level 2. You are quite the character for one so young. I shall do my best to aid you. Blonde level 3. My purpose in my last life was complete. I have no regrets, yet I thank you for giving me a new purpose. Bond level 4. You are a good person, you have a kind soul, and I will admit it is a kindness I am unused to. Bond level 5. I am a slave knight. I was always meant to serve another, yet, to serve you, it is not a bad thing. I thank you for giving my title meaning beyond simple sacrifice. Birthday. A birthday. Yes, those are supposed to be celebrated, aren't they? I offer my congratulations then. During an event. Someone is kicking up a commotion outside, perhaps we should investigate. First ascension. I feel, perhaps younger. Maybe I am going hollow in my old age. Second ascension. No. I definitely feel younger, my thanks, I can move more freely now. Third ascension. I'm very close to being stronger still. Perhaps you would find your time better served aiding the more talented servants than an old man such as I. Fourth ascension. So, you decided to do it, did you? Very well. I shall try to live up to your hopes. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.